Good morning, everybody. Today is Tuesday, June 25th. You're joined by me today, Lewis, here filling in for Jordan as he is away at the moment. He'll be back at some point, I think tomorrow. He'll be back around. But I am a pleasure to join you all. That made no sense. I'm a pleasure to join you all. You can tell I'm a little out of practice, but it is before 8:30 Central Time where I live here in Texas. But we've got some big news coming today. From the NTSB. Last year around this time, we had the kind of initial preliminary report from the NTSB on everything that happened in East Palestine, Ohio. Today, we are getting the final report from the NTSB as of what actually happened. Colin, we can pull up the tweet from the NTSB kind of explaining what is going to be happening today. So this is reminder tomorrow, which is now today. The NTSB will hold a board meeting to determine the probable cause and issue safety recommendations in connection to the February 2023 train derailment with subsequent hazardous material release and fires in East Palestine, Ohio. So that meeting will be taking place in about 12 minutes here later this morning. They'll be meeting in East Palestine at the East Palestine High School to be going over this. But for those of you just joining right now, if you could please go ahead, smash the like button. I'm keeping an eye on the comments over here. So if you have questions throughout this hearing, feel free to let me know. While you may not have seen me as much recently, Jordan has been continuing to push on this story. Obviously, I had 5 on-the-ground trips over the course of last year and the beginning of this year. I spent about a month of actual time on the ground in East Palestine, trying to get the stories out of not only the folks who are tied up in all of this. We covered everything from their health symptoms to the issues on the financial side of things with folks who are wanting to get out and leave their homes in which they were getting sick in for months and months and months. And now we're literally talking over a year and being left to essentially fend for themselves in a situation where the state government is essentially doing nothing for these people. The local government is essentially doing nothing for these people. The federal government to date has essentially done nothing for these people. And on the financial side of things, the only help that they've been able to get is when they had gone to beg and plea from Norfolk Southern, the people who caused all of this to begin with. This isn't new to folks who have kind of stayed in touch with this story over the last year and a half. If you asked me a year and a half ago if we would still have a million unanswered questions, I probably would have thought you were crazy, but this is the story that's done it for me. Nothing surprises me anymore at this point in time. But yeah, just to give a little bit of a recap of some of what we learned at last year's NTSB hearing, because that NTSB hearing was a big deal. It kind of confirmed suspicions that Jordan and I and many residents in East Palestine had over the course of our initial reporting over the first 5 months or so of the story. That was when we had the really bombshell news that the owner of the vinyl chloride itself, a gentleman went and testified on behalf of a company called Vinyls. Vinyls owned the vinyl chloride that was being transported through East Palestine on the night of the derailment. That same vinyl chloride that was subsequently detonated in this small town. Not exaggerating here, that is what happened. The decision was made to just detonate this in a small town. At that hearing, though, we learned from this gentleman that Vinyls, the company that owned the vinyl chloride, knew as much as possible about the vinyl chloride, more than anybody else involved in the situation, advised Norfolk Southern on multiple occasions that they did not need to detonate those cars, that there was no imminent risk of explosion, and that the cars did not need to be exploded, which obviously would have led to a much different scenario in East Palestine, Ohio. Now, would there have still been issues after the initial derailment and fires that were caused? Absolutely. But there's no doubt in my mind or in anybody's mind at this point in time that the kind of worst fallout from this was the decision to detonate 5 cars of toxic chemicals over a small town, and then less than 3 days later tell everybody that it is totally fine and safe to return to their homes. The Environmental Protection Agency telling people it's fine to go home and it's safe to be in your homes, when in reality, over the last year of reporting, we know that that was not true. Whether it be my early reporting in a year ago, March, this was only a month and a half after the derailment. Nobody was talking about this. And I was able to break the story that the air testing devices that were being used in East Palestine, Ohio, were not sensitive enough to pick up chemicals of concern, whether that be butyl acrylate, which we had, EPA Representative Mark Durno on video admitting you don't need, or you can't test for vinyl chloride. You can't test for butyl acrylate until it is 5 times the level of concern with the devices that they were using. Vinyl chloride is questionable whether you're going to find it at certain levels. Hydrogen chloride, phosgene was never going to come up at all. And formaldehyde, one of the potential chemicals of concern after these cars were detonated, you wouldn't catch with these devices unless it had a special attachment on it. All of that was a story we broke in detail with experts on the record, all sorts of folks back in March of last year. But again, I mentioned, our reporting has continued. And again, for those of you just joining right now, if you can help us out by please smashing the like button. We are getting ready for the final report from the NTSB hearing. That will be coming up shortly. We will cut over to this when it does actually get started. But if you could help get this out to more folks, share this live stream and consider pressing the like button. Again, we're keeping an eye on the comments as well throughout this live stream so that we can make sure we answer your questions as we go. Because some of this stuff, you might need a little bit of a refresher. Some of this stuff is things that, we talked about a lot last year. Again, though, we have continued pushing this story forward. Colin, let's go ahead and pull up the latest from Jordan, actually. Jordan's now been to East Palestine twice. So that makes, I believe we're at 7 or 8 trips to East Palestine in total as Status Coup at this point. Again, covering this for the last year and a half. So I'll just read the headline here and then kind of summarize a bit. Exclusive EPA hid discovery of toxic vinyl chloride in East Palestine. Won't disclose levels they detected. We direct Norfolk Southern to deal with it, is what EPA official Mark Durno told Pennsylvania resident Christina Seisloff, who we've had on the show and I've met with several times in East Palestine. It's clear that they're hiding things that they find, is what a chemist that Jordan spoke with on this said. So we have been continuing to put this story in giving it the focus that, frankly, it deserves. It's been kind of just blatant, out in the open, just abandoning this small town who, by no fault of their own had this happen. They asked a lot of questions early on because they were all getting sick. And then here we are 18 months later, maybe going to find out all of the details surrounding what actually caused this derailment in the first place, who is to blame for this derailment in the first place, and all of these details. And again, I want to emphasize this point that we learned last year at these NTSB hearings that, again, I was out of town for these, but Jordan covered them relentlessly. At the NTSB hearing last year, we learned that Norfolk Southern was advised on multiple occasions by the people who owned the vinyl chloride, who knew the most about the vinyl chloride, that the vinyl chloride cars did not need to be detonated. The decision to detonate those cars was the most harmful potential thing that could have happened to those residents in East Palestine. It led to, obviously, the explosives of a carcinogen, a known carcinogen with the vinyl chloride, but the chemical plume and all of the chemicals involved in that, things like formaldehyde, things like phosgene, which is literally a weapon of war, things like formaldehyde, things like hydrogen chloride, things like dioxins, which are some of the most harmful chemicals known to man, were created in that. The smoke plumes went for miles and miles. And then the EPA came in and told everybody that it was safe to return to your homes. They told these people, they told them that they could go home, that they could bring their children home. And what happened is that we talked to dozens and dozens and dozens. I've lost count. It's well over 100 people between Jordan and I that we've talked to in this town. And the vast majority of them have dealt with some sort of health issue as a result of all of this. And it's disgusting that that's how this has all gone down in the United States of America, let alone in 2023 and in 2024. You'd think we would be better than that. If you're able to support the kind of reporting that has led us up to this point in covering this disaster in East Palestine, the only reason we were able to be on the ground 7 or 8 times over the last year and a half is because of our amazing members, people like you who fund Status Coup to continue being on the ground. Now, I haven't been around very much lately. I've been busy with other work, but Jordan and the team have been absolutely grinding out there, continuing to cover these stories relentlessly, whether it be East Palestine, whether it be Flint, whether it be Kalamazoo, whether it be, you know, covering protests across the country. John Farina is out there all the time. If you're able to support this sort of reporting, Tina, Ron, all these guys, statuscoup.com/join is the best way to be able to do so. We want to make sure that we can continue to get these stories out there, continue to, frankly, hold these officials to account. I mean, on some of these early trips, you'll remember, no one was holding these people accountable. I directly confronted Governor DeWine on the first trip. He was not super happy about it, if you'll remember. You know, I got to ask questions of Senator J.D. Vance the last time I was in town, and asked specifically about something that we might find out today is, you know, is there any sort of criminal liability to any of this? J.D. Vance said he needed to hear more from the NTSB. Well, we're going to hear more from the NTSB today, shortly in the next couple minutes here. And again, we're going to cut away to the NTSB hearing as soon as it starts. That is really what we're here for this morning. And we are going to keep an eye on it throughout the morning. I'll probably kind of pop in and out throughout as we learn new things and try to summarize what's been going on. I will keep an eye on the comments. So please leave comments in there. Super chats are absolutely welcome. We'll make sure we definitely get to those. But if you have questions about what's going on throughout this, happy to try to answer them as we go along. But again, really can't emphasize enough that this sort of reporting that we've had over the last year and a half to get to the point where we are today is only due to the support of members out there like you. Again, if you're able to help us out, statuscoup.com/join is the best way to do so. But without further ado here, we've probably got another minute or two ahead of this hearing. Let me just pop in for 1 second and make sure here. We actually did have an interesting announcement yesterday. Colin, do you mind pulling up, let's do article number, link number 2 that I sent you this morning. And there's an article within it, but we'll read this quickly first if you don't mind pulling it up. No rush on it. So this was a tweet from Dr. Andrew Welton. And he said, this is good, but it wouldn't have affected the East Palestine and Pennsylvania evacuation sites. The ERG guidebook says evacuate for 1 mile per leaking VC rail car. That was not done for the 5 VC rail cars Norfolk Southern wanted and ultimately blevied, which is detonated. That's the fancy term for detonated. The evacuation zone was too small. If you don't mind clicking on the article, and I'll just summarize a little bit, you can just give me the headline. So the headline on this was railroads must provide details of hazardous cargo immediately after derailment under new rule. You don't have to pull up the story here. I'll summarize it just because I want to be ready to cut into the NTSB hearing. But essentially, Norfolk Southern announced, along with the federal government ahead of this hearing, that they're going to be actually cutting in and, actually, I'm seeing that the hearing looks like it might be started here.
For those who
we'll
are
cut
not
away to the
familiar
hearing
with
here. And again, I will pop out intermittently.
Federal agency
thanks for joining us. I'll keep an eye on the comments as well.
With investigating every civil aviation accident in the United States and significant events in all modes of transportation, including train derailments. In accordance with our regulations, NTSB's accident and incident investigations are conducted to determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances relating to an accident or incident and the probable cause thereof. This information is then used to ascertain measures that would best prevent similar accidents or incidents in the future. Accident and incident investigations are fact-finding proceedings and are not conducted for the purpose of determining the rights or the liabilities of any party. Today's meeting is open to the public in accordance with the Government and the Sunshine Act. We're here to discuss the final investigation report of the February 3rd, 2023 derailment and subsequent hazardous materials release involving Norfolk Southern Railway General Merchandise Freight Train
I love the
32N
when hazardous material
East
release instead of
Palestine,
explosion.
Ohio. The derailment occurred shortly after a hot bearing detector broadcast a critical alarm about a wheel bearing's temperature. 38 rail cars derailed, 11 of which were transporting hazardous material. 3 of these hazardous materials tank cars sustained mechanical breaches during the derailment and released flammable or combustible materials. 5 others released flammable gases as a result of fire exposure and deliberate breaching with explosives to perform a vent and burn procedure. On behalf of the entire agency, I want to recognize the significant impact that this derailment has had on the community in East Palestine, Ohio, in Darlington, Pennsylvania, and all the surrounding areas throughout the state of Ohio, throughout the state of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, some have sought to minimize the wide-ranging impacts of this derailment, pointing to the fact that there were no fatalities or injuries. For this, we are certainly grateful, but the absence of a fatality or injury doesn't mean the presence of safety. The absence of a fatality or injury doesn't mean the presence of safety. The NTSB exists to ensure the presence of safety, to shine light on the vulnerabilities that compromise safety. We don't wait for a death or injury to occur. We bring safety issues to the forefront and make recommendations that, if implemented, would prevent the next train derailment or fire. To the community at large, on behalf of the NTSB, I'm so sorry that this happened. We are so sorry that this happened here. Our hearts are with you. Today may be difficult for many of you. So volunteer mental health clinicians from the American Red Cross and Salvation Army are available throughout today's proceedings. Please see staff at the back. We have Elias Contanis and we have Stephanie Matonic from our Transportation Disaster Assistance Division in the back, wearing NTSB logo gear. They will connect you with the appropriate representatives, and thank you to the Salvation Army and the American Red Cross for their support. I also want to thank Chris Neifer, Superintendent of East Palestine City Schools, and the entire staff of East Palestine High School for hosting us once again for this final board meeting and for all their work and kind words and actions welcoming us to East Palestine during the investigative hearing last June. I want to thank the East Palestine Police Department, East Palestine Fire and EMS, the Columbiana County Sheriff's Office, Ohio State Highway Patrol, in particular the Lisbon Post, and Federal Protective Services Region 5, Chicago, for working with us closely since day one of this investigation through our hearing in June and now this board meeting. I also want to thank the numerous police officers, firefighters, dispatchers, hazmat teams, EMTs, and others who responded to this derailment. 48 entities were involved in the response, including the East Palestine Police Department, the East Palestine Fire Department, and fire departments from neighboring county communities and throughout the state, including East Liverpool and Beaver County. Thank you so much for all you do and every day to ensure safety. Our investigative process entailed extensive development of the facts and circumstances surrounding the accident. We conducted fact-finding with the input of our parties and conducted a public hearing. Following the hearing, we developed a transcript and added it and all statements to the public docket, which is available on our website at ntsb.gov. Thus, the fact-finding portion of our investigation was complete months ago. That aspect of the investigation culminated with an offer to our parties to make party submissions in which they could provide proposed findings to be drawn from the facts that we developed, otherwise called the evidence produced during the course of the investigation, a proposed probable cause, and or proposed safety recommendations designed to prevent future accidents. We have utilized the intervening time to conduct analysis, independent analysis of the evidence, a part of our independent investigation that is within the sole purview of the NTSB. Now, each board member has studied the draft report and met individually with the investigative team, but this is the first time that the board has gathered together to discuss the report. In a moment, the investigative team will walk us through the event, present the pertinent facts and analysis, and findings and summarize the findings in detail. After their presentations, board members will question staff on the key safety issues uncovered during the investigation. Staff will then propose the relevant findings, probable cause, and safety recommendations for board consideration. Following the incorporation of any amendments voted on today, the final report will be available on our website in a few weeks. This allows time for staff to make final edits. However, an abstract will be available today. There are 2 public dockets for the investigation. One was released prior to the hearing in June 2023 and includes the complete hearing transcripts. The second docket was released on January 25, 2024 this year. Again, they're available at ntsb.gov. Before we hear from the investigative team, I'd like to invite Member Graham, who again was the board member on scene during this investigation, to make a statement. Member Graham, you're recognized for as much time as you may consume.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Chair Hamady, board members Chapman, Brown, and Inman, investigative staff, and those joining us in person and live online. As we convene today to conclude our investigation into the train derailment in East Palestine, I want to begin by acknowledging the profound impact this incident has had on the community. To the people of East Palestine and the surrounding communities, we extend our deepest sympathies. We recognize the fear, disruption.
Just a reminder, we are watching the NTSB final hearing here on what's happened in East Palestine, Ohio. I'm going to cut right back in a second here. The first woman speaking, Jennifer Hamady from the NTSB. We're now hearing from Michael Graham. One of the things the NTSB saying they're so sorry that this happened. I'm sure that folks in East Palestine are tired of hearing that they're sorry that it happened and wish that somebody from the federal government, some federal agency was doing something for them. But I'm sure, I guess for now, we'll take the sorries. If you're joining us right now, though, again, we're going to cut right back in here in a second. Please smash the like button to help get this out to more folks. If you've got questions on what's going on in the comments, we will do our best to answer them as we go. But we'll bump right back into the hearing.
Fellow volunteer firefighters to protect their community and the dangers they faced on the scene. Later, the firefighter's mother surprised us by bringing the NTSB investigative team a crock pot full of homemade sloppy joes, chips, and water for lunch. I'll never forget that. To me, the story of that mother and the son symbolizes the spirit, the resilience, and the character of East Palestine and the surrounding communities. In the wake of the immense tragedy, the community came together. Your strength and unity in the face of adversity has deeply moved us. Today, we present our findings mindful of the challenges faced by those affected. We are here to ensure that the lessons learned from this derailment will lead to meaningful change so no other community has to relive the challenges faced by the people of East Palestine. I also want to extend my deepest gratitude to our investigative team. Your dedication and meticulous work have been exemplary. Your efforts not only help us understand what went wrong, but pave the way for vital safety recommendations that, if implemented, will prevent similar accidents in the future and enhance the safety of our nation's railways. To the community of East Palestine, please know that your safety and well-being are at the forefront of our mission. Our work will not end with the issuance of the safety recommendations today, but rather we will continue to pursue and advocate for these safety recommendations until each one is implemented. Thank you, Chair, for this opportunity to make an opening statement, and I look forward to the meeting today.
Thank you so much. Well said. Excellent statement. Before turning it over to the investigative team, we held a community meeting last night to discuss our investigative process. I see many are back today. Thank you so much for coming in and meeting with us last night. I invite everyone back tonight for another community meeting at 6 right here in this room to answer questions you may have regarding the proceedings today, regarding all our evidence, regarding findings. We can get into as much detail as you want, and we will be here in this room for as long as it takes to answer all your questions and make sure you're heard. I'll now ask Deputy Managing Director for Investigations, Brian Curtis, to introduce members of the NTSB team participating in today's meeting. Good morning, Mr. Curtis.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair Hamady. A few announcements before we begin. I kindly request the folks here in the auditorium, if you have not already done so, please silence your mobile phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, the NTSB will call 911. We also have medics on site who are trained to provide CPR and use an AED. The NTSB.
Again, we are, this is live from East Palestine. We should be hearing from the actual investigators shortly here, but we're kind of doing some introductions here. NTSB, again, last year there was a lot of bombshell news out of this. We learned that the owners of the chemical vinyl chloride that were in these cars came out and testified that they told Norfolk Southern on multiple occasions that the train cars, in fact, did not need to be detonated in this small town. And Norfolk Southern advised advised to do it anyway. So we're hoping to hear a little bit more information on what exactly happened. This is the kind of final report from the NTSB. They did hold a town hall meeting last night. From what I understand, not a whole lot was shared, but it was preparing people for today's meeting, which is kind of going underway now. I will kind of pop in and out throughout. Please go ahead and hit the like button if you're seeing this for the first time. If you've got questions, pop them in the chat there, and I will do my best to answer them throughout, but we'll pop right back into the hearing again.
Joey Ryan, mechanical. Greg Scott, signals, train control, and wayside defect detectors. And Dr. Stephen Jenner, human factors. And behind me in the second row, left to right, Jen Adler, director for the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Tom McMurray, general counsel for the NTSB. Michael Badinsky, Deputy Director for the Office of Research and Engineering. Carol Waldrop, Safety Recommendations. Andrew Dykestill, Technical Writer-Editor. Adrian Lamb, Materials Laboratory. Michael Portman, Vehicle Recorder Laboratory. And Zach Zagata, Operations. The presentations will begin with an investigation overview by the investigator in charge, Ruben Payan. Mr. Payan.
Good morning, Chair Hamidi and members of the board. This morning, I will start with an overview of the accident investigation, followed by presentations from the group chairs in their specific investigative areas. On February 3rd, 2023, about 8:54 p.m., eastbound Norfolk Southern freight train 32N derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. The train consisted of 3 locomotives and 149 mixed freight rail cars, which included 20 placarded hazardous material tank cars. 17 of those tank cars were loaded and 3 were residue tank cars. The derailment involved 38 freight rail cars. Among the 38 derailed cars were 11 tank cars carrying flammable and combustible hazardous materials. 5 of these were DOT 105 specification tank cars and were carrying vinyl chloride monomer. The accident also involved 12 additional rail cars that did not derail but were damaged by the post-derailment fires. Emergency responders established a 1-mile evacuation zone that affected about 2,000 residents. Train 32N originated at the Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis Yard in Madison, Illinois on February 1st, 2023. The train departed eastbound with a Norfolk Southern train crew and was destined for Conway Yard in Pennsylvania. On February 2nd, the train arrived in the Norfolk Southern Yard in Decatur, Illinois, where 55 rail cars were removed from the consist and an additional 40 rail cars were added to the rear of the train. One of the locomotives at the head of the train was also repositioned towards the middle of the train. Upon departure from Decatur later that same day, the train consists of 3 locomotives and 149 rail cars remained unchanged throughout the train's subsequent movements. The train arrived in Toledo, Ohio on February 3rd, where the accident crew, an engineer, a conductor, and a conductor trainee went on duty. The accident crew conducted a briefing with the previous train crew and tested the train's brakes before departing. The train departed Toledo, Ohio, beginning the last leg of its trip before the derailment. After the accident, investigators obtained surveillance footage from private homes and local businesses that captured train's 32N's movements covering a distance of more than 50 miles. In Salem, Ohio, about 26 miles from the point of derailment, Surveillance footage recorded the train with the glow of a fire visible underneath the 23rd hopper car. As the train continued into Columbiana, Ohio, surveillance footage recorded the hopper car with a fire underneath the lead axle. This was about 10 miles from the point of derailment. About 4 miles from the point of derailment, surveillance footage recorded the train in New Waterford, Ohio, with fire and sparks underneath the same hopper car. Finally, in East Palestine, surveillance footage recorded the train showing a visible fire underneath the hopper car. As train 32N approached the point of derailment, the train encountered 3 wayside hot bearing defect detectors. Train 32N fully traversed the 2 defect detector locations at Sebring and Salem and began to traverse the East Palestine defect detector location when a critical alarm was received over the lead locomotive radio. The critical alarm reported axle 101 on the south rail, which corresponded to the left side bearing on the first axle of the 23rd rail car, the GPLX 75465 hopper car. Locomotive event recorder data indicated the train was traveling about 43 miles per hour at that time. After receiving the critical alarm, the train crew began to stop the train. According to the locomotive event recorder data, the engineer began to slow the train using dynamic braking before 8:54 p.m. Shortly afterward, as the train was still passing over the East Palestine hot bearing detector location, the train experienced a train line initiated emergency braking application. The head locomotives traveled about 1,670 feet before coming to a stop 38 seconds later. The crew radioed the Norfolk Southern dispatch center that it had experienced an emergency. The Norfolk Southern dispatcher confirmed the emergency at 8:56 p.m. and began coordinating train movements in the area to prevent other trains from colliding with train 32N. The NTSB investigation established that the following factors did not contribute to the accident. The track's condition and geometry near the derailment site did not show any defects that could have caused or contributed to derailment. The traffic control signal system and the positive train control system were functioning as designed at the time of the derailment. The crew of train 32N acted in accordance with Norfolk Southern operating rules, responding appropriately to both the bearing alarm and the derailment itself. The vinyl chloride monomer was loaded in a manner sufficient to stabilize the vinyl chloride monomer for transport and was shipped under the correct proper shipping name, UN 1086 vinyl chloride stabilized. The derailed hazardous material tank cars were not overloaded by weight or volume, and none of the 6 derailed DOT 105 tank cars sustained mechanical breaches during the derailment, including the 5 carrying vinyl chloride monomer, and none released lading except to the pressure relief device activity or the vent and burn operation. The investigation identified several safety issues in this accident: wheel bearing failures and detection, initial emergency response, hazardous material and tank car derailment performance, and the vent and burn operation. This is a list of the NTSB investigative staff that worked on the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment investigation. Additional NTSB investigative staff that also contributed to the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment are listed here. Parties to the NTSB investigation included the Federal Railroad Administration, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the Ohio State Highway Patrol, the Village.
Again, we're watching the final hearing of the NTSB in East Palestine, Ohio. We're going to bump back in a second. Yeah, they did exclude a bunch of reasons why it didn't fail. I think that they're going to get into is the ignoring of the hot bearing detectors that they mentioned. They passed 2 to 3 of these detectors saying along the way that the train bearing was overheating, which is what ultimately, I believe, has led to this. And we're going to get potentially more information here. But they're kind of ruling out that it was just like ordinary track infrastructure, signals and train control systems. the train crew performance, although, if you're passing multiple of these bearings, are they being told to not stop? Lots of questions still here, but we'll see in a second. We're going to bump right back in.
Derailment. Norfolk Southern, like most Class 1 railroads, have voluntarily installed these devices, but image and audio recorders are not required by FRA regulations for freight locomotives. For this investigation, Norfolk Southern only provided 20 minutes of data. The audio and video data that was provided demonstrated and confirmed that the train crew were alert and responded appropriately to the hot bearing alarm. Additionally, the data were instrumental in corroborating train crew statements. Previously issued recommendations regarding locomotive audio and image recorders were prompted by railroad accident investigations in which NTSB determined having inward and outward facing audio and image recorders would have provided crucial information that could have improved safety. Therefore, staff has proposed reiterating one recommendation to the Secretary of Transportation, 2 recommendations to the FRA, and 1 recommendation to the Class 1 railroads to install crash and fire protected inward and outward facing audio and image recorders with a minimum 12-hour continuous recording capability. This concludes my opening presentation. Next, Mr. Ryan and Mr. Scott will be presenting on wheel bearing failures and detection, followed by Mr. Lloyd, who will discuss the initial emergency response, and then Mr. Stansel will present on hazardous materials and tank car derailment performance issues and the vent and burn issues. Mr. Ryan.
Good morning. This presentation will cover the bearing failure and wayside detection systems. This is a cross-section depiction of a typical railroad freight car wheel and bearing. As you can see, typical components in this bearing include rollers, cages to align the rollers, and oil seal to retain the grease and protect it from environmental conditions. This bearing is pressed onto the end of the axle known as the journal. The weight of the car is supported by 8 bearings, 4 on each side of the car. Upon arrival, investigators found the #1 axle with the left #1 journal burnt off from the hopper car GPLX 75465 that was carrying plastic pellets. This car was the 23rd car from the front of the train of a total of 149 car consist. A healthy or undamaged journal is cylindrical in shape. High temperatures and a defective bearing typically twist the journal into a conical shape and then falls off, allowing the car to drop to the ground, and in this case, to derail. A teardown of the opposing bearing on the same axle was inconclusive, meaning no defective conditions were found that would indicate a possible bearing failure. The bearing had set in the fire and perishable evidence was destroyed, including the grease seals, the outer cage, and the grease. In Madison, Illinois, the train was mechanically inspected by qualified mechanical inspectors, also known as carmen, as required by federal regulations. In Decatur, Illinois, the added 40 cars were also inspected by qualified mechanical inspectors as required. The train then proceeded to East Palestine, Ohio, where the incident took place. Post-accident inspections revealed that about 25% of the cars had federal defective conditions.
I want to point out that these inspections are very short when they're done. We're talking like a minute or 2 per car. The train was headed in an easterly direction with the #1 axle leading. I am providing this slide as a visual indicator of the location of the left #1 wheel and a photograph of the actual hopper car involved and a graphic below. The NTSB investigated 2 other incidents that occurred on Norfolk Southern Railway after the East Palestine derailment that also had burnt off journals. One in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, where a train traversed a hot bearing detector with a hot bearing, but the alert was not sent due to being miswired from earlier maintenance and a journal burnt off and the train ultimately derailed. And in Elliston, Virginia, where a train crew received a hot bearing alarm after traversing a hot bearing detector, stopped and verified that the bearing was overheated and proceeded forward, bypassing the first set-out location at track speed where the bearing continued to overheat and ultimately burned off the journal and derailed. The mentioned cars with defective bearings from East Palestine,
Newcastle, and Elliston had 3 similar findings. They were all axle position number 1. They were all bulk hopper service type cars, and all 3 also had reconditioned bearings. Currently, there is no national database to research historical trends. What we found was there are no standards pertaining to operational responses to bearing alerts and alarms. A bearing database capturing bearing failure and replacement information could help identify bearing failure risk factors. We are proposing one recommendation to the Federal Railroad Administration to establish rules.
There are
governing
no
railroads.
standards pertaining to operational responses to bearing alerts and alarms. So they have these alarms. They went off multiple times that we already knew, but there's no standards for these alarms, which is wild.
Failure risk factors. Now, Greg Scott will cover wayside detection systems.
Thank you, Joey. Above is a basic view of a typical hot bearing detector location to show the different parts. On the top right, you have a signal bungalow where the internal electronic equipment is housed and all the external equipment is connected. The signal bungalow also contains an external temperature sensor that helps determine the external ambient temperature. On the bottom right, you have 2 transducers that are both mounted on the same rail. These are magnetic sensors used for counting axles and determining the direction of the train. These were the items in the Newcastle derailment that Mr. Ryan spoke of earlier that were wired incorrectly. On your top left, you will see a dragging equipment detector. These paddles are on a pivotable axle and are designed to sense anything that may be dragging from the train. Bottom left is an item of focus in this investigation. These are wheel bearing scanners that are located on both rails and designed to monitor bearing temperatures. The map you see is the last 3 hot bearing detectors the accident train 32N traversed.
As they explain this, I want to point out one thing that was, I kind of glossed over and I just double checked here. So essentially, after the derailment happened in their investigation, they found that 25% of the cars on the trains had federal defections of some point or another, meaning they were not meeting the standards of what they were supposed to be, even after they were inspected, being put into service on the train line. Again, we've talked about on this channel over the last year and a half that these inspection timelines are short. Jordan and I have talked to people who work in the industry, and they are pressured to do these inspections as quickly as possible. And the fact that 25% of the cars had some sort of defection leading into this is absolutely outrageous and shows that this is probably a much, much, much more widespread issue. And this could happen somewhere else. I just wanted to make sure that that point was not lost. We're going to jump right back in here as the information on the wayside detectors is being explained. This is showing, though, on the screen right now where the different alarms first went off. Obviously, in Salem going off first. And then eventually being very, very hot leading to the point of failure in East Palestine.
The Salem hot bearing detector. When the 32N passed through the Salem detector in this location, it only showed 103 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient air temperature, which was recorded at 11 degrees. We know fire burns hotter than 103 degrees above ambient, so in theory, the hot bearing detector should have shown a critical alarm. Instead, the detector sent a non-critical alert to the back office analyst. We believe the fire that was visible was the grease that had began to burn on the outside portion of the bearing and was not detected as a hotter temperature due to the scanner aimed at the inner portion of the bearing as shown in the figure on the right. During critical alarms, when a train is occupying a detector and the defect has been detected, an automatic radio transmission is sent to the train crew. A typical message will begin with an announcement of a critical alarm and repeat 3 times. It will then follow with a detector milepost location, followed by the words hot box, meaning excessively hot journal. The message will then indicate the exact axle of the alarm location and on which rail. A typical critical alarm message will sound like the following recording.
Critical alarm Critical alarm. Critical alarm. Norfolk Southern milepost 9.9. Hotbox axle 671 East Rail.
After the train receives this message, it must immediately stop for an inspection consistent with safe train handling procedures. The Federal Railroad Administration has no regulations regarding critical alarms. The Association of American Railroads does have recommendations for an overheated bearing, which states a bearing is deemed overheated when it reaches 170 degrees Fahrenheit when identified by a hot bearing detector. Prior to the accident on February 3rd, Class 1 railroads temperatures for critical alarms range from 136 degrees Fahrenheit to 190 degrees Fahrenheit. After the accident on February 3rd, Class 1 railroads temperatures range from 136 degrees.
So much of this stuff we knew already and has been like fairly public, but there's still no Federal Railroad Administration regulation on wayside detection, which would have triggered, you know, if there was some sort of federal rule that says you have to stop when this goes off once, this doesn't happen. And the fact that a year and a half later, our federal government has done nothing on this is absolutely wild. Wild. Ugh.
The Salem hot bearing detector are sent to a back office analyst called an advanced train control analyst. The analyst monitors all alerts and alarms and follows standard operating procedures on when to take action. This analyst also communicates with train crews to help them determine the exact location on their train of any alert or alarm. Pictured above is a screen an analyst would see displayed. It is color-coded to help him quickly distinguish the severity of alerts and alarms, with red being the most severe. When the analyst chooses a particular hot bearing alert, this is the screen he may see displayed. This screen is of the alert the analyst saw of the non-critical alert from the Salem hot bearing detector. The top portion is comparing the bearing in question to the bearings in the train itself, the 32N. The bottom portion is the trending of that bearing from the other detectors the train has passed previously. Shown is axle 101, bearing L1 with a temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Per Norfolk Southern operating procedures, the analyst would simply monitor the first non-critical alert. Action is not required until 3 consecutive alerts are received that are above their threshold standards. Then the train is to be inspected when safe to do so, and delay can be minimized. Analysts would contact the crew via radio and instruct the crew of the situation and advise them to contact the dispatcher for a location to perform the inspections. Currently, the FRA has no regulations regarding temperature trending and alert limits. The Association of American Railroads does have recommendations for temperature trending and when a bearing is deemed overheated.
So you have, again, no regulations. You have some recommendations from the Association of American Railroads, but no regulations as well. I see someone in here, Pete Buttigieg gets this on the engine. I mean, frankly, where is the Department of Transportation, the federal, like, a lot of this stuff, like, they should have been on this already. You now know that, again, on this, like the gentleman right there explaining this just said, Norfolk Southern doesn't have to do anything when these go off. It's Norfolk Southern's own policy that they allow these bearing detectors to go off 3 in a row. It has to go off before it triggers a time where you would stop to do an inspection, so that delay can be minimized. That's the whole point here. Make sure the train keeps moving. We don't want to delay this because that's money on the line right there. Wild that there are 0 regulations in this, and that the Department of Transportation and the Federal Railroad Administration has allowed this. Like, they've had a lot of this information for a while now and have done nothing to try to push forward any of these. We're going to jump right back in. Smash the like button if you're just seeing us right now. We'll be jumping right back in.
First, to research the effectiveness of current detection systems and identify minimum standards and make this research available to the public. Second, use the results from this research to establish minimum requirements for the use of the bearing defect detection systems. And third, establish requirements for installation, inspection, and maintenance of wayside bearing defect detectors. Now Troy Lloyd will cover the initial emergency response.
Thank you, Craig. Good morning, Chair and members of the board. This presentation will discuss the following: the early emergency response timeline, including initial firefighting activities, State of Ohio firefighter training standards, the availability of train concept information, and tank car placard legibility and durability. The East Palestine Police and Fire Dispatch Center received the first 911 call at 8:56 p.m., reporting that a train had derailed with explosion and fire. The dispatch center radioed the East Palestine Fire Department at 8:58 p.m., requesting all available fire and emergency medical services units to respond. The fire department and the police department arrived on scene about 9 p.m. The East Palestine Police Department were first to arrive on scene and started evacuating homes near the burning tank cars. They also established control zones entering the incident site. The deputy fire chief arrived on scene a few minutes later. After assessing the incident scene, the deputy fire chief assumed the role of incident commander and established a command post at the Lake Oil property site adjacent to the derailment pileup and burning rail cars. The early emergency response at East Palestine focused on containing the fire and protecting residents near the derailment site. The incident commander instructed the fire dispatch center to use the emergency notification system to advise residents near the derailment to shelter in place. At about 11 p.m., Norfolk Southern personnel and contractors arrived on scene and started an assessment of the incident scene. They informed the incident commander of the dangers of having personnel operating near the burning rail cars. Also, about 11 p.m., residents within a 1-mile radius were ordered to evacuate the area. Developed by the United States Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the Emergency Response Guide is the go-to guide for emergency responders working at.
I want to point out as well that in first responders who were on scene the night of the derailment, many of these, frankly, volunteer firefighters had no idea what were the chemicals up until roughly as late as midnight. In a lot of cases, they were out there not using the same equipment that they would have been using. And a lot of these folks, from their descriptions directly to us at Status Coup, said that there was a lot of lack of clear information being presented. Also important to note that no one from Norfolk Southern was on scene until at least 2 hours after the train derailed, which feels very unacceptable.
UN numbers, material names, placards, or other missing identification indicators. The decision tree leads the emergency responder to the mixed load unidentified cargo page or guide 111. Without referencing the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook, firefighters approached the pileup and began applying water to contain the fire, which grew rapidly. The correct guidance from the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook was the mixed load unidentified cargo or guide 111 for a fire involving tank cars. The guide advises a 1/2 mile preliminary isolation and evacuation of the scene. While the firefighters acted in good faith to protect their community, the initial emergency response did not conform to the guidance for fires involving tank cars and unknown materials. In Ohio, volunteer firefighter training is mandated by state statute. A training course for a volunteer firefighter certificate is limited to 36 hours by statute, cannot include participation in training involving hazardous environments, and does not include training in hazardous materials response. The volunteer certification is classified as a support level training only. Fire chiefs or authorities having jurisdictions are responsible for providing additional training for volunteers that are expected to operate in hazardous environments. However, The NTSB is concerned that volunteer fire departments in the state of Ohio are called on to respond to the same incidents as their professional counterparts, as seen in this accident, but the volunteers may only have a fraction of the training Ohio and the NFPA require for professional firefighters. Firefighter 1 certification meets the minimum standard for professional firefighter professional qualifications established by the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, and recommended minimum level of certification to provide firefighting services in the state of Ohio. The course includes advanced firefighter training, hazardous materials awareness and operations level training, and training on the National Fallen Firefighters Association 16 life safety initiatives. In addition to the Firefighter 1 course, students are required to complete an emergency vehicle operations course and training on the National Incident Management System. Firefighter 2 is the highest level of firefighter certification available in Ohio. The Firefighter 2 certification is typically required for career firefighters in the state of Ohio. The certification meets the minimum.
As these are being explained, I want to highlight again a couple of the main points here that we've found on here. The biggest takeaway so far to me has been that since this and even before this, there's been no federal regulation on wayside detection, which is the technology used to kind of identify these heating up wheel bearings and whatnot, to explain it in the most basic way possible. That should have stopped this train much sooner as these detections were going off. And also that it seems as if as this derailment happened, now that they've been able to look at it, 25% of the train cars had federal defections of some kind, even after being inspected. Again, the inspections of these trains that happen are very quick. In speaking with somebody who works in the industry who had previous experience actually working at Norfolk Southern, this individual shared with us that these inspections could be anywhere from like only 1 to 2 minutes per car, and that they're incentivized to do them as quickly as possible so that they can get the train moving as quick as possible. Again, we also heard that the reason that Norfolk Southern's internal recommendations for, especially when these wayside detectors go off, their internal recommendation is that 3 of these bearing detectors can go off in a row, which are miles and miles apart from each other, before they will then stop when it's safe to stop to do an inspection. And here's the part to underscore, and that is so that delay can be minimized. The name of the game in all of this from the beginning that we talked about, even the first week we were in East Palestine in February of 2023, was that the whole point is to get the trains moving back again as quickly as possible. And this is just kind of more to pile on to that case here. We'll jump right back in here to the hearing. Again, this is the NTSB kind of final hearing in East Palestine, Ohio. We'll jump right back in.
And requested consent information for train 32N. The individual who answered the phone said that they would call back, but we did not find evidence of a return phone call. The Columbiana County Emergency Management Agency director received the train consist from Norfolk Southern via email about 10 p.m. The director then emailed the train consist to the East Liverpool fire chief, who was responding as the hazardous materials branch chief. The incident commander learned through phone conversation that the burning tank cars contained vinyl chloride monomer. After obtaining this information, all firefighters were instructed to evacuate the area, and the command post was relocated about 1 mile from the derailment site about midnight. The East Palestine fire chief arrived on scene about 2 a.m. on February 4th, assumed the role of incident commander, and obtained a copy of the train consist at the new command post. The delayed transmittal of the train consist increased the time emergency responders operated in the hot zone and delayed the recommended emergency response guidance evacuation distances.
It's
This resulted in
unnecessarily
greater
putting
exposure.
first responders at risk, basically. So these volunteer firefighters, in many cases, regular people who were trying to help out, did not get the information from Norfolk Southern when they should have, and likely are going to be suffering health consequences as a result, and already have in many cases.
Immediate access to accurate, timely data about what type of hazardous materials a rail car is carrying, so they can make an informed decision about how to respond to a rail emergency. Ask Rail was designed to give first responders immediate information about rail cars carrying hazardous materials and be an invaluable tool for helping prepare those on the front line should a rail incident occur. Since the incident, the Columbiana County Emergency Management Agency has coordinated with NS and Ask Rail to provide training to each of the 5 county 911 centers on the use of the Ask Rail application. The NTSB has investigated other accidents involving train consist availability, including the July 10th, 2005 collision and derailment of 2 Canadian National Railway Company freight trains in Anding, Mississippi. The accident resulted in 4 train crew member fatalities, the release of 15,000 gallons of diesel fuel that burned for about 15 hours, and the evacuation of 100 residents. As a result of that accident, the NTSB recommended to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, with the assistance of the Federal Railroad Administration, require that railroads immediately provide to emergency responders accurate, real-time information regarding the identity and location of hazardous materials on a train. On July 24th of 2024, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration published a final rule titled Hazardous Materials Fast Act Requirements for Real-Time Train Consist Information. The rule requires all railroads transporting hazardous materials to maintain a separate electronic consist for hazardous materials trains. The rule also requires railroads to immediately contact local emergency responders and provide them with consist information in the event of an accident involving a train carrying hazardous materials. Class 1 railroads have 1 year to comply to the rule. Class 2 and 3 railroads have 2 years. Despite the 9 p.m. request from East Palestine Fire Dispatch, Train 32N's consist information did not reach emergency responders until shortly before 10 p.m., when it was delivered as an email to one of the emergency response agencies. Not until about 11 p.m. at the recommendation of the Ohio State Patrol did the East Palestine Fire Department Deputy Fire Chief, acting as the incident commander, issue a 1-mile evacuation, the distance recommended by the 2020 Emergency Response Guidebook for fire involving tank cars transporting vinyl chloride. About the same time, NS personnel and contractors began arriving on scene and recommending that firefighters redeploy to safer distances. Firefighters suspended fire suppression activities and relocated to safer positions around midnight on February 4th. Therefore, staff proposes one recommendation to Norfolk Southern Railway, that it review and revise its policies to ensure that accurate train consist information is immediately available to emergency responders during an emergency. Staff also proposes the reclassification of one recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. With the assistance of the Federal Railroad Administration, require that railroads immediately provide to emergency responders accurate, real-time information regarding the identity and location of all hazardous materials on a train. Rail cars containing hazardous materials must be placarded in accordance with federal placard design requirements. These placards can assist emergency responders with identifying hazardous materials and safe response actions. As shown in the pictures, some placards were destroyed and could not be used to quickly identify the train's hazardous materials. Although placards must be capable of withstanding weather conditions, the federal design standard does not address derailments or fires. Placard requirements should include survivability sufficient to ensure that they are usable by emergency responders during rail transportation emergencies. When a shipping name or identification number cannot be associated with a tank car or other package during an emergency response, the Emergency Response Guidebook recommends reading placards from a safe distance to determine what protective measures are appropriate. Federal regulations require that placards must be capable of withstanding 30 days of exposure to open weather conditions without deterioration or a substantial reduction in effectiveness. The performance standard does not account for placard survivability during derailments.
This feels like a huge miss that these placards are not designed to be able to deal with fires and explosions and whatnot. They're only designed to deal with weather conditions. Because Norfolk Southern dragged their feet for seemingly at least an hour and a half in getting this information to first responders. First responders would have been able to see these placards in a lot of cases if they had, were readable. In many cases, it seems like they were not.
And members of the board, my presentation will cover several additional hazardous material safety issues identified during the investigation, including those issues listed on this slide.
This is likely going to be a big one here. I will do my best to explain if there are moments that get confusing, but
the post-derailment fire likely began with a punctured DOT 111 tank car that released butyl acrylates, a Class 3 flammable liquid. This tank car sustained head punctures sizable enough to have rapidly released its contents, spilling the chemical along a 1,100-foot segment of track. The fire spread to other rail cars and combustible materials released from the train. DOT 111 tank cars are susceptible to breaching damage because the design does not typically include safety systems that have become standard for more robust specification tank cars, such as the DOT 117. These safety features include head shields, steel jackets, thermal protection systems, top fittings protection, and tanks fabricated from thicker normalized steel for puncture resistance. Fire exposure from burning released lading caused pressure relief devices, or PRDs, to actuate on intact DOT 105 tank cars carrying vinyl chloride. This led to Norfolk Southern and its contractors voicing concerns about vinyl chloride polymerization. The events that eventually led to the vent and burn action could have been avoided had there been no DOT 111 tank cars carrying combustible and flammable liquids on this train. In accordance with the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or FAST Act, which requires phase out of flammable liquids tank cars not meeting minimum DOT 117 performance specifications, the damaged DOT 111 tank car that released butyl acrylates in this derailment would no longer have been authorized for transportation and flammable liquids service after May 1st, 2029. The East Palestine derailment has prompted calls for accelerating the pace of the DOT 111 phase-out mandate. While industry acknowledges the capacity to accomplish an accelerated phase-out, a recent Federal Railroad Administration report found that economic disincentives could make this unlikely under voluntary action. In addition, the Secretary of Transportation does not have discretion to change the compliance dates. Staff has therefore proposed a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to seek legislative authority for an accelerated phase-out of DOT 111 tank cars in flammable liquids service.
So this literally
Fast
could have
Act
been
does not
prevented
require
if again,
non-pressure
like
tank
no
cars
fire
used to
means none of
transport
this.
combustible
They've been
and
using these
other
cars.
flammable materials to meet DOT 117 specifications. Of the 3 DOT 111 tank cars that were breached in this accident, 2 of them were carrying combustible liquids, which were not subject to the Fast Act's phase-out. Based on their long history of poor derailment crashworthiness and an unacceptable safety record, the presence of DOT 111 tank cars in a mixed freight train increases the probability of lading releases from other, more robust tank cars. Therefore, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to the pipeline and hazardous material.
Yeah, if we take away anything from this, and I'll let him keep talking in a second here. If we take away anything from this, is that there are basically no regulations, and these cargo rail lines regulate themselves, meaning they don't regulate at all. They again are all about delaying or minimizing delay, getting things moving as fast as possible, with no regard for the communities that they go through. And it seems like most of our federal government, whether it be the Department of Transportation and frankly the Congress that needs to act to pass more strict laws on this, need to do something, but they won't because we know that the railroad lobbies are in many of their pockets. But the main takeaway here throughout all of this is the major lack of regulation. And what regulation is coming is in small pieces, years and years from now down the line.
That were corroded and seized. These components did not withstand the effect of corrosive gases produced by vinyl chloride. Aluminum-coated pressure relief device valve springs that had been significantly deteriorated. The vinyl chloride manufacturer's safety data sheet states that the material is incompatible with aluminum and reactions with this substance can be strongly exothermic. The protective housing covers of 3 vinyl chloride tank cars made from aluminum melted and allowed the aluminum to re-solidify onto pressure relief device components. Aluminum has a much lower melting point compared with steel and is susceptible to thermal damage. These photographs show the accumulation of aluminum in the pressure relief device structures, which must remain free of debris to ensure adequate venting capacity. The thermally destroyed and missing protective housing covers shown in this photograph led to metallic debris accumulating in the pressure relief device. Aluminum valve hand wheels were also destroyed, hampering any attempt to unload the tank cars through normal means. Although the use of aluminum components rendered the tank cars susceptible to thermal damage, there was insufficient evidence in this incident to determine whether this contributed to the release of hazardous materials. To ensure that tank car safety equipment components meet safety requirements, the manufacturer provides designs to the Association of American Railroads, or AAR, for approval. Although federal regulations require the pressure relief devices to be made of materials compatible with the lading such that they have sufficient flow capacity to prevent tank overpressure during a fire, the AAR does not conduct independent testing, reference relevant scientific literature, or require demonstrations of manufacturers' representations. Therefore, the approval process lacks a means of verifying the equipment will perform in service as required. Because this incomplete review process may create safety hazards that could be avoided by more careful reviews, staff has proposed a safety recommendation to the Association of American Railroads for establishing criteria to demonstrate tank car service equipment.
Thank you for the super chat, Morel Compass. We appreciate it.
Additionally, staff proposes one safety recommendation to the Federal Railroad Administration for oversight of the recommended AAR action and to use its regulatory authority to address weaknesses in the service equipment approval process. Federal regulations prescribe operational requirements for high hazard flammable trains, or HHFTs, that are designed to mitigate derailments in trains carrying large quantities of flammable liquids. Safety benefits of the regulation are derived from special routing, incident planning, speed restrictions, braking, and requirements for the use of more survivable tank cars. These requirements currently pertain to trains containing 20 or more loaded Class 3 flammable liquids tank cars in a single block, or 35 such tank cars distributed throughout a train. Train 32N was not defined as a high hazard flammable.
Not defined as a high hazard flammable train. I can't imagine what would have happened if it was a high hazard flammable train. Are we kidding? Jesus.
Or similar to scenarios the high hazard flammable train rules were intended to prevent, and also demonstrate that mixed freight trains carrying flammable gases and combustible liquids are also vulnerable to cascading fires and hazardous materials releases. Thus, the probability of a fire-induced cascading hazardous materials release depends in part on variations in tank car survivability and on the presence of additional flammabilities other than Class 3 flammable liquids. Staff proposes a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration for revising the high hazard flammable train regulatory definition to include additional hazardous materials and subject these requirements to fewer numbers of applicable tank cars in a train. The Association of American Railroads defines key train in Circular OT 55, which establishes recommended operating practices for the transportation of hazardous materials. Key train definitions include 20 carloads or intermodal portable tank loads of any combination of hazardous material and fewer numbers of rail cars when certain commodities such as poisonous or radioactive materials are present in a train. Key trains are restricted to a 50-mile-per-hour maximum speed. If a key train wheel bearing defect is reported by a wayside detector, but a visual inspection fails to confirm the defect, the train must not exceed 30 miles per hour until it is passed over the next detector or delivered to a terminal for mechanical inspection. Cars with confirmed defects must be set out from the train. Because the train only contained 17 loaded hazardous materials cars, Train 32N contained too few hazardous materials cars to classify it as a key train under current definitions. The protective requirements for key trains provided in Circular OT 55 should account for the elevated risk posed by the presence of DOT 111 tank cars carrying hazardous.
The issue here is with these like kind of random regulations here and there, the railroads are always going to continue to carry one less than what is required so that they don't need to follow these rules. And when they don't follow, these rules, I mean, it's frankly, in a lot of cases, they're not even breaking rules right now because clearly we don't have nearly enough regulations in place. You end up with more instances like what happened in East Palestine.
February 4th, about 5:30 p.m., Norfolk Southern and its contractors observed an unusually energetic release of burning vapor from the pressure relief device of one of the vinyl chloride tank cars. Norfolk Southern contractors, SPSI and SRS, interpreted the incident as a sign that vinyl chloride had polymerized and obstructed the tank car pressure relief device. This energetic pressure relief device actuation of a 70-minute duration, followed by cessation of activity, marked their first consideration for the need to conduct vent and burn actions. During his post-incident interview, the SPSI president remarked, "We are already there at a vent and burn in our minds." Federal regulations require hazardous materials shippers to provide comprehensive emergency response information for materials they offer into transportation. Beginning on the morning of February 4th, Norfolk Southern and its contractors communicated with Vinyls, the vinyl chloride manufacturer and shipper. On February 5th, Vinyls deployed 3 experts to the derailment scene. In its communications with Norfolk Southern and its contractors, Vinyls assessed a low probability of dangerous polymerization given the condition of the intact tank cars. And they recommended monitoring the tank car temperatures for evidence of exothermic polymerization reactions. Vinyls further explained that the vapor pressure within the tank cars, the vinyl chloride tank cars, would only reach the level necessary to actuate pressure relief devices when the lading temperature reached 185 degrees Fahrenheit. Vinyls also advised Norfolk Southern that because the tank cars were not breached and were therefore under positive pressure, oxygen could not have entered the tanks to destabilize the vinyl chloride and promote polymerization. Contrary to Vinyls' technical advice, Norfolk Southern and its contractors interpreted tank car temperatures as signs of dangerous polymerization. While the temperature of 4 tank cars remained stable, the downward trend in tank shell temperature on a 5th tank car should have prompted a pause in proceeding with the vent and burn action based on their understanding the chemical reactivity was related to the tank car temperature. Instead of the cooling temperature trend shown on this slide, a runaway polymerization reaction would have produced a rapid and sustained exponential temperature increase. The observed temperature trend in tank car OCPX 80370 shown on this chart is not indicative of a polymerization reaction.
Meaning this did not need to be blown up.
Curiously, Norfolk Southern's manager of hazardous materials told NTSB investigators that according to Vinyls, if the tank car shell temperature had risen to a critical temperature of 185 degrees Fahrenheit, a runaway polymerization reaction would have ensued. This is incorrect because, as Vinyls explained, 185 degrees Fahrenheit is the temperature at which the vapor pressure would have been sufficient to actuate pressure relief devices. This erroneous runaway polymerization statement suggests a misunderstanding or confusion between Vinyls' technical support team and Norfolk Southern's expert contractors.
I don't know if misunderstanding is the right word there.
As
Maybe an
the
intentional.
intensity of the fires
Let's clean this
reduced.
up quickly.
Norfolk Southern contractors interpreted the cessation of pressure relief device actuations as evidence they had become blocked with the formation of polymer. However, this was most likely because tank car temperatures were too low to produce sufficient vapor pressure to actuate them, or the lading had become depleted by their earlier pressure relief venting. Despite this contradictory evidence, Norfolk Southern and its contractors continued to assert the necessity of a vent and burn, even though available evidence should have led them to reevaluate their initial conclusions.
And again, much of this was learned last summer at this
Tank car
NTSB
loading
hearing.
records confirmed the vinyl chloride had been stabilized by oxygen removal. The tank cars remained under positive pressure until the vent and burn, preventing the infiltration of oxygen and other contaminants that could have promoted polymerization reactions. Examination of the internal PRD, or pressure relief device components, recovered from the tank cars found no evidence of polymer obstructions that would have affected their function.
No evidence of
This
polymerization.
lack of solidified matter within the service equipment cavities does not indicate a polymerization reaction occurred within the tank cars.
So confirmed that they were not at risk of imminent
Available
explosion.
scientific information and evidence suggests the vinyl chloride did not undergo polymerization, and the vent and burn action therefore would not have been necessary to prevent a polymerization-induced tank car rupture. Nevertheless, a PHMSA hazardous materials incident report database query found that Norfolk Southern reported polymerization as the cause of the package failures for the 5 vinyl chloride tank cars. Staff proposes one recommendation to Norfolk Southern Railway to revise its incident report to accurately reflect the package failure cause.
Meaning they kind of lied on the package report, or they had the wrong information, but
Vinyls had
frankly,
no
the
direct
report is
interaction with
incorrect.
the East Palestine Fire Chief Incident Commander or with elements of the Incident Command other than Norfolk Southern and its contractors, SPSI and SRS. Their technical information and conclusions about the lack of dangerous vinyl chloride polymerization were not relayed to the Incident Commander, and the Incident Commander was not aware that oxyvinyls was available as a source of expertise.
Because Norfolk Southern kept
The
that
Incident
information from
Commander
them, which should be
approved the
criminal
vent
in
and
this
burn
case.
action
Jesus.
based on information provided by Norfolk Southern, SPSI, and SRS in 2 meetings with the Incident Command staff. However, Norfolk Southern and its contractors, who were in control of the derailment scene assessment, compromised the integrity of the vent and burn decision by withholding complete and accurate expert opinions and information from the Incident Commander. Further, the Incident Commander could have made a better informed decision about the vent and burn action had oxyvinyls been a participant in the Incident Command meetings.
This is pretty big. I think this is the most clear the
Vent and
NTSB has
burn
been
is
on
a
this,
self-
that the, and this is explaining what a vent and burn is, which you've heard quite a bit on this channel, but the NTSB here is saying directly that Norfolk Southern withheld information from the Incident Commander, which could have led to better decision-making to not detonate these cars in this small town, which led to all of the major issues we've seen with this over the last year and a half, from health concerns to financial issues because of the health concerns and people wanting to leave. And all of this could have been prevented, but Norfolk Southern purposefully withheld this information from oxyvinyls. The Incident Commander on scene, the fire chief, did not even know that oxyvinyls were available to answer questions. These people were the experts on vinyl chloride. All of the information that they gave to Norfolk Southern said, we do not think you need to detonate these cars for reasons X, Y, Z that we saw on the forums here. Norfolk Southern decided to not share that information and instead advised them to explode the cars anyway. And that is absolutely, I mean, again, we've known this stuff and we have talked about this stuff throughout, but we're going to jump back in here.
Pre-existing expectations while dismissing or failing to seek contradictory evidence. Whatever the underlying explanations were for the continued support of a vent and burn action, none justifies failing to communicate accurate and complete information, including dissenting expert opinions, to the Incident Command. Staff has proposed a safety recommendation in Norfolk Southern to address accurate communications with incident commanders. Sources of vinyl chloride hazard information that Norfolk Southern and its contractors referenced while forming initial judgments about the potential for catastrophic tank rupture included the Chlorine Institute Pamphlet 171. This pamphlet provides guidance for safe handling and emergency response for vinyl chloride transported in rail cars and contains information related to polymerization hazards. Among the communications regarding vinyl chloride hazards, the pamphlet states that at a pressure above 68 psi-G or a tank surface temperature above ambient may be indicative of polymerization. These statements do not take into consideration other explanations of elevated temperatures and pressures and can lead the reader to incorrectly conclude that polymerization is occurring. Expert testimony at the NTSB investigative hearing, scientific and historical.
I do want to highlight again a couple important points here as we're kind of getting into the weeds on vinyl chloride and whatnot. And I want to give some props to Abigail Batar, who's she's another journalist who's covered this, and she's kind of summarizing this quite well on Twitter at the moment. But There's a couple big points here that have happened. Number one, 25% of the cars had federal defections on them that were involved in this, even though they were inspected just 100 miles or so up the tracks in Toledo or at their original spot further down the line. We had the biggest one here kind of most recently, the kind of most clear statement from the NTSB that Norfolk Southern, number one, did not accurately portray what happened with the vent and burn and needs to revise their incident report. The NTSB is finding that Norfolk Southern did not convey complete and accurate information to the incident commander regarding the vent and burn, and that the, quote, the incident commander could have made a better decision regarding the vent and burn had Norfolk Southern shared the accurate information from oxyvinyls. The incident commander did not even know that oxyvinyls were available to answer questions, and these are the people who owned the vinyl chloride itself. They know the most about the vinyl chloride. They were saying that, nope, if temperatures are going down, as we saw on the charts on the screen, it is not at risk of imminent explosion, and other alternatives could have been investigated, such as continuing to let the cars cool down and reassess and potentially do this in a much, 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 much safer, much less risky fashion. Instead, Norfolk Southern intentionally withheld this information from the incident commander, the person who's supposed to be making the decision, this small town fire chief, who they blamed for making the decision to vent and burn so many times in different Senate hearings and whatnot. And yes, he made that decision because you withheld the correct information from him. This should be criminal. This small town had a bunch of carcinogens set on fire, and they were told it was safe to return 3 days later. Told it was safe to return their families and kids. And this didn't even need to happen. But Norfolk Southern is making it right after they intentionally withheld information that could have made this way, way, way much less severe of a situation. Disgusting. Disgusting. Ugh.
Device actuations and indicators of hazardous polymerization are all relevant to the accuracy of emergency response guidance. This information collected during the response to this incident is a vital resource in ensuring that hazardous materials guidance is supportive of emergency response actions. Thus, staff has proposed a safety recommendation in Norfolk Southern Railway to address policies for contractors to keep detailed records and share information used to make emergency response decisions. In 1994 and in 2007, the Federal Railroad Administration published reports about the vent and burn method for tank cars, in which it recognizes it is a valid but high-risk procedure to be used only as a last resort for certain flammable, liquefied, compressed gases. These reports contain guidance for how an incident command should approach such a decision. However, the guidance could be improved with more comprehensive information regarding what products are appropriate for vent and burn action, what hazards may result, and an intuitive decision tree to aid first responders who may consider employing the method. At the time of the East Palestine incident, the incident commander was not aware of the report's existence and would not have had access to it because it had been marked sensitive security information. Recently, the Federal Railroad Administration lifted the security restrictions for these reports and published them on its website.
So not only did he not have the information from oxyvinyls, but he also did not have the information on, the specifics on a vent and burn
rupture. Such action could be appropriate under different circumstances. Therefore, the significant impact of a vent and burn action to a community demonstrates the need for widely available federal guidance on what circumstances and what products are warranted for the procedure. Staff has proposed 3 recommendations to the Federal Railroad Administration to address the need for updated and more comprehensive vent and burn guidance and for increasing its availability to emergency response agencies. One recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration for distribution of the guidance, and one recommendation to the International Association of Fire Chiefs, International Association of Firefighters, and the National Volunteer Fire Council to inform their membership of the circumstances surrounding the vent and burn and the availability of the federal guidance. Chair Hamady, this concludes staff's presentations.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your excellent presentations. We're going to take a break till 11:05. It's about 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and go to the question rounds. For the community's preparation and those watching, we'll have 30-minute break for lunch from about 12:30 to 1. That's approximate depending on how we're going. And we'll do another 15-minute break around 3 o'clock. But we will be back at 11:05 and start promptly at that point. Thank you.
All right, so we are going to stay with this for now. We've got about a 15-minute break. This is, again, the NTSB final hearing on everything that went down in East Palestine, Ohio. I want to summarize some of what was discussed this morning. If I'm being totally honest, I mean, so there are some big pieces in here, yes, but a lot of this has been this is the clearest that the NTSB has said some of this information, but it's not all that new if you've been following the story extremely closely, like Status Coup has, obviously, over the last year and a half. To me, there's a couple key points that stood out. Bear with me, as obviously we just watched this live, so I don't have the clips necessarily for you, but I'm going to try my best to kind of summarize here what has gone down. So a couple key points. So this is a smaller one, but Norfolk Southern only provided 20 minutes of kind of communications and video data of what happened on the train. There's now recommendations that there should be just kind of 12 hours of continuous recording on the front of the train and inside. It's basically no regulations on that at all at this point in time. The amount of regulations on any of this is slim to none in so many cases here. A bigger point here that I think is important, this train was inspected in, and I want to see if I can find the actual map here so I can give you the correct names. I was taking screenshots of the slides as we were going. Bear with me. For those of you who are watching right now, if you haven't pressed the like button already, please consider doing so. All right, so we had, no, that's not the correct one. Anyway, the most previous spot that the train had cars loaded onto it was in Toledo, Ohio. And the previous spot was a little bit further down. I'm blanking on the name of the yard that it was in. Colin, if you are able to find the map of where the train originated from, that'd be great. If not, no big deal. It was inspected when it was at the origination point. It was inspected in Toledo as cars were put on. Despite those inspections, it seems as if this train in the NTSB investigation had over 40 federal safety issues. That's roughly 25% of the cars had federal defections, according to the NTSB investigation, which tells me that these inspections need to be improved. If 25% of your cars on this train that were carrying cancer-causing chemicals had some sort of defection or another, that is wild to me. Not okay. Covering the story over the last year and a half, Jordan and I have had the opportunity to speak to folks who work in the industry. We actually spoke to a former Norfolk Southern employee at one point who talked about these kind of inspections to us. And this person's insight into it was that they were encouraged to do these inspections as quickly as possible so that the trains could leave the stations. And I mean, we're talking somewhere in the realm of just like 2 minutes per train at best, 2 minutes per car. And when, as we saw this morning, we're looking at wheel bearings and all of this sort of stuff, which is what caused this. There's no way you're looking at every single wheel bearing or anything like that during these inspections. And maybe that's not necessary, but rushing through these inspections feels obviously unsafe at best. So 25% of the cars had federal defections, according to the NTSB investigation here. And there's essentially no standards pertaining to these kind of alerts as far as the bearings go. We covered some of the wayside detectors. These are the things that set off alarms essentially as the train was approaching East Palestine. Wow, there's been too much Palestine in the news now. East Palestine. As the train was approaching East Palestine, these wayside detectors were set off. There are currently 0 federal regulations regarding these wayside detectors. Instead, there are internal regulations from Norfolk Southern, which means they're just kind of a recommendation. Norfolk Southern essentially allows for 3 of these detectors to go off before the train will pull off to be inspected at a reasonable time where they can safely do so. And I quote here, so that delay can be minimized. That is the name of the game, is minimizing delays. They want to get the trains from where they started to where they're going as quickly as possible, frankly, with no regard for safety, as we can see in a couple instances here. This is just a smaller one of them, but so that delay can be minimized. The wayside detectors, 2 of them went off beforehand, and as it was approaching the 3rd in East Palestine, the train derailed. So waiting for 3 of them clearly is not the right approach. And the fact that the Department of Transportation and our Congress and everybody else have done nothing to try to improve these. Frankly, it needs to go through Congress. A lot of this stuff have not pushed forward any railroad legislation since this happened is disgusting. And we should all, there's nothing else to say about it. It's gross. It's gross. Moving on a little bit further. Obviously, last year during these hearings as well, we heard directly from a representative of Vinyls. This is the company that actually owned the vinyl chloride itself that was inside of these cars. These folks are going to be the experts on the chemical that they obviously own, right? Vinyls last year testified to this, that they advised Norfolk Southern on multiple occasions that with all the evidence that they were seeing, the vent and burn did not need to happen, that polymerization was not occurring. Polymerization occurring would be what would lead to the tanks exploding, essentially. So polymerization not occurring means that, while the cars may have heated up at one point, they had gone through some stuff, they were not at risk of imminent explosion. And that was the reason, that was the justification that Norfolk Southern used for the detonation of these cars, was that, we think polymerization's happening, it's at risk of imminent explosion, blah, 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 blah. So now we have, we learned that last summer, but now we have the most kind of direct information coming from the NTSB, clearly stating that, number one, those communications 100% did happen. Vinyls did tell Norfolk Southern on multiple occasions that the detonation did not need to happen, that polymerization was not occurring, and the NTSB officially has evidence in actually inspecting the pressure relief valves, the tanks themselves, that polymerization of the vinyl chloride did not occur. I'll say that again. Polymerization of the vinyl chloride did not occur, meaning those cars were not at risk of imminent explosion, meaning you do not need to make a hasty decision to blow them up in a small town. It's not that difficult. And in addition to all of this, Norfolk Southern had that information and purposefully did not make it available to the incident commander, the fire chief, whose job it was to make the final decision. They withheld that information intentionally. The fire chief did not, according to the NTSB, the fire chief did not even know that Vinyls was available to answer questions. How is this not criminal? Norfolk Southern messed up. Their train derails in this town. They have a subject matter expert, the person who owns the goddamn chemicals. They own the chemicals. They know what the deal is with them. They are the expert on it. And they intentionally withhold information that would lead to an outcome that would not involve exploding carcinogens in a small town. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here, but this is big. And again, we did learn this last summer to a degree when the Vinyls people came and testified to this, but now the NTSB has even more evidence. The NTSB is kind of coming out pretty clearly and saying this stuff. But man, I mean, it's again, this should be criminal in my opinion. There are a couple other pieces of information here, and I'm very interested to get to the questioning portion of this. Again, there's just taking a little bit of a break here, and I believe in a matter of 3 or 4 minutes, we should be jumping right back in. When they do start up again, we are going to bounce back in for questions, and we'll kind of see where things are going at that point in time. But this is absolutely outrageous. Again, we've been covering this story literally since it happened. I was on the ground there. I want to say it was 10 days after the derailment happened, with John Farina at the time. Colin, who's behind the scenes here right now, has been to East Palestine a couple times. Jordan's been to East Palestine. Collectively, I mean, we're at 7 or 8 trips on the ground in East Palestine. Personally, I've spent about a month on the ground in this town, speaking with residents, hearing their concerns, but also breaking real stories. Even as recently as just a week or two ago, Jordan continuing to break news in East Palestine. If you're able to support the kind of work that we've been doing over the last year and a half, as we're now at this point, please consider helping us out here. We're only able to do it because of folks like you. StatusCoup.com/join is the place to do so. It makes a huge difference to be able to tell the stories of what's going on in East Palestine, but beyond that, what's going on in Flint, Michigan, what's going on in Kalamazoo, what's happened in, all sorts of these issues kind of across the country. We're also covering all sorts of other stories with things that, whether it be what Tina's working on, what Ron Placone's been working on. I know Ron was on last night to talk about the news with Julian Assange. If you're able to support the work, StatusCoup.com/join is the best way to be able to do so, because frankly, who else has spent the time on the ground in East Palestine? Who else has? I mean, there are a couple people, don't get me wrong, but the people who should be, these fucking, I shouldn't be dropping an F-bomb, I don't think, but the mainstream media has basically moved on from the story. I'll be curious if this makes any headlines at all tonight. Instead, we're going to be talking about some BS debate that's going to be happening on Thursday, and the political horse race of which old man is going to potentially do better in this presidential election. I mean, to me, this feels more important, the poisoning of a small town, and then, frankly, the federal government doing nothing about it. What has the federal government done about this? Nothing. We're providing recommendations now through the NTSB. Recommendations. Like, are they going to do anything with the recommendations? I don't know. Can't tell. I got a little bit worked up. This is an early. I'm in Central Time, so I guess it's not super early now, but I was not expecting to be this high energy for this one. But man, I mean, this story is the I don't want to call it the gift that keeps giving, but it's because it's not a gift for any of these people or for me. I mean, I don't want to hear about this stuff anymore. It's terrible. It's terrible what this corporation and what our government has allowed these people to be put through. It's disgusting. Again, we are tuning in here to the final NTSB report coming out of East Palestine. They're just on a short break. They should be getting started any second now, frankly. If you're watching this right now, though, please go ahead and hit the like button. It helps us continue to get this out there. I am keeping an eye out on the comments as well. If you're here on YouTube or wherever you're watching, I believe all the comments feed through here to me. So if you have specific questions or anything, drop them in the comments and I will do my best to answer as we go and kind of interject. I try not to interject too much just because I want you to be able to hear everything. But when it starts to get into the weeds a little bit, or if it's a part that is clearly not super relevant to what's been discussed, I'll kind of pop in and out just to give the highlights. But man, I mean, this is there's a lot going on here. I want to just double check here to make sure I'm not missing any key points. Give me 1 second. I had some notes here. Yeah, I mean, again, this is up until this point, some new information, but also just, additional confirmation from the NTSB. I'm very curious to hear how the question format of this is going to go. So essentially what's going to happen next is I believe it's 5 members of the NTSB board who are the ones who will essentially vote on these recommendations and whatnot. Now we're going to have the opportunity to question the NTSB staff members who have been doing the investigation. So some of those staff members are the folks we've heard from so far this morning, who were presenting the information. Now those staff members are going to be available
Third, hazardous-
for questions. And we'll jump right back into that hearing that's starting back up again right now. Again, if you're able to support us, statuscoup.com/join to be able to support this kind of reporting. I'm also keeping an eye on super chats. And if you haven't already, give the video a like. It helps us get this out to more folks. Now we'll jump right back into the hearing.
To limit their questions to the specific safety issue at hand, we found that it helps the public better follow the discussion. We're going to limit questions to 2 rounds. By my calculation, that gives us about an hour per section, plus about 30 minutes for a catch-all round for anything that is not in these 4 areas. And we'll see if there is time left over under one section, we'll carry it over to the next section. And again, we'll have a catch-all round at the end. We're going to begin our discussion on wheel bearings failures and detection. Member Graham is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start with just kind of the beginning, if we could. Like when I was here, came up here with the investigative team. We know the derailment occurred at milepost 49.5. Can you please discuss how the investigative team determined the exact point of derailment like you did for me on that Sunday?
Yeah, so when we arrived post derailment, there was marks on the rail that would indicate that the truck frame from the hopper car had fallen onto the rail, showing scrape marks. When the opposing wheel derailed from the opposing track, it made flange marks into the ties, indicating that that's the point of derailment.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to jump to the L1 bearing damage assessment. What impact, if any, did the reconditioning of the L1 bearing have on this derailment?
The findings on our teardown were inconclusive, meaning that generally when a bearing gets hot and burns off the journal, it gets destroyed in the process. This was a reconditioned bearing. Reconditioned bearings have about half the life of a new bearing. The opposing bearing was tore down, as it's the closest exemplar bearing that would possibly be in the same type of service as the bearing that burnt off. So that bearing was tore down, and it was also inconclusive because it was in the pool fire for a long period of time, and perishable evidence was destroyed, including the seal, the grease, and one of the internal components. The cage was also burnt and melted and missing.
So I think it's good for the public to know, is it uncommon to have a reconditioned bearing on a freight car or a tank car?
A majority of the bearings on freight cars are reconditioned bearings.
Because the life of a car goes for how long? 30, 40, 50 years sometimes?
The life of the car?
A life of a car?
Yeah, you're correct.
So it's not uncommon for an unconditioned or a reconditioned bearing on a car.
Yes.
You did talk about 2 other investigations we're doing in Newcastle and Elliston that occurred as a result of failed reconditioned bearing. Are we able to determine any commonalities or trends across the 3 derailments?
Yeah, so those 3 derailments, they were all burnt off journals due to bearing defects, and the commonalities were they were all on axle position 1. They were all reconditioned bearings, and they were all in hopper car bulk type service.
Okay. So how would a database of bearing failures support the identification of trends and underlying commonalities?
So after these 3 incidents occurred, our attempt to try to search the industry for this type of data to try to stratify any data to analyze why or when or which type of bearings and what kind of service they're in take place, and that database doesn't exist. So things that we could look for would be the mileage on the bearings, the type of service that it's in, if they're a reconditioner or not, who the reconditioner was, and more items.
Okay. I know AAR currently maintains a database, but what do they maintain as far as a database? And would this be a good starting point for a better database of bearing failures?
Yeah, so that type of data is recorded through the AAR in a application called RailLink. And the type of the information that they keep is the mileage of the bearing, when the bearing and the wheels were pressed onto the axle, where it took place, the type of car that it was applied to. So the data exists, but it doesn't exist in one database. So you can find it on a car per car basis, but not as an industry-wide database.
Okay. I noticed AAR, they define overheater bearing based on what makes a rail car repair billable to a rail car owner or leaser. Considering the limitations and everything like that, is this basis of AAR's definition of an overheated bearing appropriate to prevent derailments?
That's one reason that we recommend to have a database to accumulate that data.
Okay, thank you. I see my time.
Thank you. Member Chapman's recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on that discussion. So to clarify, the recommendation that's being proposed that we'll consider later today is for the Federal Railroad Administration to develop such a database, correct?
The recommendation is to the American Association of Railroads, or Association of American Railroads, excuse me.
Understand. So AAR rather than FRA.
Yes, sir.
Based on your experience and our knowledge and understanding of these things, what are the root causes, what typical root causes of a bearing failure?
Bearing failures most commonly fail due to age-related phenomenon like wear or fatigue of components or loss or breakdown of lubrication. If they fail earlier, not due to aging, it can fall into 3 categories.
Just to interject here, so they're having a questioning period right now in the East Palestine NTSB final report hearing. This portion is specifically on the bearings. One of these bearings is what actually failed. Norfolk Southern had plenty of warning that it was about to fail because it was going off in these the wayside detectors for several miles leading up to East Palestine. They did not do anything with those recommendations per their internal guidelines, are to wait for 3 alarms to go off before you do anything. That 3rd alarm that would have gone off is on the other side of East Palestine, Ohio. And obviously the train derailed there. And also, so we had a super chat from Das Bush Fleisch. Good to see you as well. Long time no see. Thanks for the super chat. We appreciate the support as usual.
Sort of inspection, that sort of regulatory inspection involved?
Part 215, 49 CFR Part 215 is identified as railroad freight car safety standards. And it basically, in a nutshell, covers the running gear, the frame of the car, and coupler and draft systems.
And if the defect or the root cause of this bearing failure was internal, would that sort of inspection have caught it?
It's possible. It's unlikely. Most of the damage occurs inside of the bearing and it's not visually seen. Can we please pull up slide 103? So this, you can see the bearing from different angles, and you can see that there's a bearing adapter on top of the bearing, and the truck also surrounds it. So visually, you can't see a lot of the bearing. So indicators would be grease leaking out. Can we move to slide 104, please? This is showing how grease, due to a damaged seal, leaks from a bearing. These are visual indicators that the bearing could be getting ready to fail.
So there are physical limitations to detecting a bearing failure if it's internal. But in addition to that, there are some time constraints too. The draft report makes mention of a target time of 90 seconds per rail car for inspections.
This is a point I was making earlier.
Is 90 seconds sufficient target time frame for conducting adequate regulatory mechanical inspections?
Yeah, so the time limit, the time limits that are put on inspections per car is not regulatory. It's what railroads impose on themselves and their own employees. And it's variable. It depends on the type of car. Some cars, for example, tank cars and this hopper car, the truck systems and the running gear are exposed and easily looked at. Some other type of cars, special construction and auto racks are a lot harder to see because the running gear system is covered by the body of the coupler, or I mean the body of the car. So some cars, yes, 90 seconds is plenty of time. Some cars, no, that's not enough time.
And the 90 seconds referenced in the draft report is that relates to Norfolk Southern, I believe.
Yes.
Is that sort of time constraint, that time target, is that fairly typical within the industry?
It depends on the location, and also other variables would include the terrain, the yard setup, the fitness of the inspector, the knowledge of the inspector. It's variable. And I inspected cars in my previous position, and I could inspect a car in 90 seconds most of the time. Sometimes I couldn't. If you have to stop and make measurements using gauges or other tools, then it takes longer.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, and I think it's
you.
important to note too, I mean, 90 seconds per car, but you're doing the whole train. So if they say, yep, you have 90 seconds per car, and these railroads, again, there's a major incentive from folks that we've spoken with in the industry to do this as quickly as possible because they want the trains out of the train yards to continue carrying the product.
Are sudden, like this one in East Palestine. What are some of the typical failures you've seen in freight car bearings?
Well, as I mentioned before, the typical ones most commonly seen are the age-related. So due to wear of components or fatigue of components when they wear out and break and spall, or breakdown of lubrication. Otherwise, it is something to do with the assembly, causing dynamics components to stop moving or static components to start moving, like end play, or there's some sort of contamination, water ingress, or those worn components are causing contamination of the lubrication, which is spreading throughout the rest of the bearing.
Okay. Can you talk a bit more about the new bearing detection technology and how it may impact safety?
Yeah, so there's a couple newer technologies that I know of being looked at. One is onboard technology. It's actually mounted to the bearings themselves. It gives real-time data as the train moves on. Some of the companies are using vibration, I believe. Some are using a thermal system. So you would get an onboard real-time inspection of the train essentially. And it's not based on spacing of a wayside detector or whatever. There are some, say, limitations, but there are some hurdles in making this type of technology happen. When you're talking about wayside detection goes towards the railroad, so it's easily accomplished. When you go towards individual cars and mounting a detector on individual cars, each individual bearing, then you're talking about car owners, and the majority of the rail cars on the system are not owned by Class 1 railroads or the railroads. So then you have to make sure that everybody uses the same technology. It's interoperable between all the Class 1s or all the railroads they traverse. So and then you have to have power to a car, communications to a car. So in my opinion, would be a better technology, but there's a lot of hurdles to make it happen.
Okay. In this instance, we know that the hot bearing detectors did not signal the early moments of the freight car bearings becoming compromised. Can you talk about the life expectancy of these detectors and whether the age of the ones in the track near East Palestine has been an issue?
There's not a standard life expectancy on the typical hot bearing detectors that are in place now. The external components, it just is more of an environmental factor, or if there's a newer technology. Internal, as far as like the programming, it is more of a real-time thing. If there's a newer software version out, that can be loaded into the detectors immediately. They have communication through the detectors, and they can push that software standardization through with no problem. So there's not a standard life expectancy per se on that type of equipment.
Okay. I'd like to follow up on the acoustic detectors and clarify, will these be replacing the hot bearing detectors, or should they both be used in tandem? Why or why not?
In my personal opinion, I don't think they could replace hot bearing detectors. I definitely think it's a step in the right direction as you're being a pro, taking a proactive stance, and you're trying to find defects before the bearing actually fails. But we also know that bearings can fail within a minute or two. So I believe it's something that may have to be used in tandem.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Member Brown. Member Inman is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. And it's, I hadn't had a chance to meet the people of East Palestine. As you know, we weren't here for the investigative hearing, so I appreciate everything. I actually came from a town smaller than yours, 3,000 people, and it had 16 chemical manufacturers in that town. So I know what it's like for the railroads to come through, and you forget what it even sounds like until something happens. I'll start with Ruben. Does the FRA ever audit inspection practices or the associated manuals and training that go with these inspections that we're talking about?
For mechanical inspections?
Yes.
I'll actually let Mr. Ryan, he's.
I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat your question?
Does the FRA ever audit the inspection practices or the manuals and the training and how they're done through railroads?
Yes, the FRA does follow-up inspections on equipment and also their training. That is true.
And they're verifying that these inspections are occurring to the prescriptive language?
Yes, they do.
Okay. Is there a standard operating system, a standard operators use to determine what constitutes an alarm versus an alert based on hot bearing data?
There's not a standard throughout the class ones as far as a alarm. That's a critical when a bearing has failed. As far as the alerts, they're trying to predict when a bearing may fail. I think most class ones or most railroads typically start off with the AER recommendations as a starting point, and then they may tweak them one way or the other to get rid of erroneous alarms, but still keeping the parameters of finding critical failures.
Do we have any data on the number of critical hot bearing detector alerts or alarms Norfolk Southern or any other operators receive in a year?
I'm not sure a year. I know when we interviewed the analyst, he said it was not uncommon to get, several hundred per shift. And I think he said he may even get up to 300 or so per shift. Now, I will say when we talk about alerts and the analysts getting those, not all those are bearing alerts. So I think it was only 5% of those alerts were bearing alerts. I think it was in the 50s or maybe 60% was hot wheel alerts, which is most of the time a braking issue. And I think 50-some%, I don't know the exact number, but it was a one-time alert and it never re-alerted again. So it was a single occurrence.
And in this instance, in your presentation, you said that the wayside desk did not receive it?
They did receive the alert. The analyst had not had time to review the alert. So they did receive an alert from the Salem hot bearing detector. It did go in the system. It was in the analyst queue, but he had not reviewed it yet. Had he saw it, per their SOPs, he wouldn't have had to take any action on it. He would have just monitored it, because in the trending, you need to trend with more than one location. So he would have monitored that first alert to see if a second or third alert came in.
And all this is typically based around whether they can bill for a repair or not based on their trade association?
I think they start off with the Association of American Railroads guidance with their recommendations. And then each class one, as far as trending goes, they vary. The alarm limits are a little bit closer together, but as far as the trending, at the time of the East Palestine derailment, each class one varied.
So following up on the wayside desk again, I mean, as I understand it, they're wayside desks per se.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
So how are standards kind of put together about the staffing if you're talking about 300 alerts in a shift?
It's all dependent on the railroad and what their, I guess, their standard operating procedures are, the budget they have. I'm not sure how they determine that.
So they get to make their own rules?
As far as that, yes, sir.
So they get to make their own rules.
Did we look into anything regarding single person staffing? I know that was in the Norfolk Southern. Did you
Yes,
look
sir.
at
They, at the time of the derailment, they had before the derailment, I think they had multiple analysts. At the time of the derailment, they only had one analyst on per shift with a supervisor occasionally that could fill in if the analyst got overwhelmed. Post East Palestine, they have two analysts per shift on every shift. And my understanding is they're trying to go to 3 analysts per shift because of the added defect detectors and acoustic detectors that they've added to the system since this.
Thank you.
Question, I'm just going to pick up on that for a second. On the ATC desk, they had more people. They were down to 1 plus a supervisor. Now they've brought people back at Norfolk Southern. One question on, I thought it was interesting in the interview, what did the ATC desk person, did they get a lunch break?
They did, but at the time, nobody monitored. I mean,
They actually didn't. He
kinda-
said numerous times there's not an allowance for a lunch break,
Yeah.
but he would run down,
Yeah,
get his lunch, come back, and at that point, it wasn't really staffed.
Right.
It would be flashing, and if they came back, then they would take care of any alerts.
that's correct.
No lunch break, no bathroom break.
Right.
They'd have to run down and then come back.
Yeah.
Which I think
Yes,
is certainly not a way to run a railroad. Question, hot bearing detectors are certainly the primary defense against failures.
Yes, ma'am.
The railroad industry has been using it for a number of years, tracking temperatures. They're set, not really based on science, not really based on standards. We have some recommendations that we're going to talk about a little bit later that you talked about in your opening presentation. I just want to highlight, and I want you to take the time as much as you need, probably Joey or Greg. How does a bearing that was on fire only read 103 degrees Fahrenheit over the Salem hot bearing detector and 253 degrees over the East Palestine hot bearing detector? And maybe you can talk about how that occurs inside and then comes outward.
I'll let Joey start off
Great.
with the internal.
So the bearing starts to heat up due to a defect inside, causing friction, which causes heat. And then it takes time for the heat to propagate to the external part of the bearing, similar to putting an iron skillet on your stove. It has to be there for a couple minutes before it actually is ready.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because Professor Chariton, who testified at our hearing, actually said once it starts, it could take 30 minutes to an hour before that occurs. 30 minutes to an hour. One other question, and I know Adrian, Ms. Lamb had mentioned failures for bearings, which could include water ingress. We don't have any. We weren't able to determine the cause of the failure due to the extensive damage. But that is one. We know that this car was in locations where there was substantial flooding. We don't have any evidence of water ingress causing that failure. I do have a question on whether the bearing was replaced after it was sitting in those flooded areas. Do we have any evidence showing it was replaced?
No, there's no evidence of that.
And I will just note that Timken, the manufacturer, and the Association of American Railroads recommend that it be replaced when sitting in flooded areas to prevent failure. So we don't have any evidence of that, but it is another cause of problems. I guess one question I have is, if you're a railroad, how do you know? How do you know, because you don't own that car? You pick up a car. How do you know that it was either sitting in a flooded area, that it hasn't been replaced?
Yeah, typically a person would have to visually see it and then take action.
Yeah, thank you. What's the service life of a remanufactured bearing?
Well, we know that the service life of a reconditioned bearing is half of a new one.
The answers to so many of these are that like all of this could be prevented if there was like a little bit more regulation in some case. In so much of this, it's like, well, notice the language isn't the recommendation that it's this, isn't the recommendation that it's that, isn't it the policy of the company that it's this, not like what is the federal regulation? Because in most cases, the federal regulation is essentially nothing, which is wrong. And if we haven't learned anything from this, shame on our government officials, frankly, because there was a lot of talk about doing some sort of Railway Safety Act. And if you'll remember, over a year ago, I said the longer that this Railway Safety Act gets kicked around in Congress, the less likely it's going to happen. And here we are 18 plus months later with no Railway Safety Act, unfortunately.
Defect detectors have prevented numerous derailments, but what factors determine the success in hot box detectors preventing derailments?
I'd have to say, first of all, the proper installation and maintenance of those particular detectors, whether maintained regularly, if they're maintaining them properly. And then as far as, we need to have the proper alarm and alert levels to be able to accurately detect something before a derailment.
What is the single most common cause of mechanical derailments on railroads?
That would be failing bearings.
Failed bearings, yeah. And I see over the past 4 years, we're averaging over 17 overheated journal bearing accidents every year, making it the single most common mechanical cause of accidents. Yet there is no industry consensus on regulation that specifies the appropriate spacing, maintenance, or alarm threshold criteria. Can you discuss the post-derailment remedial actions reported by Norfolk Southern to increase the number of hot box detectors and reduce the average distance between them?
Yeah, so prior to East Palestine, Norfolk Southern did have one of the lower averages. They typically use an average spacing and not actual spacing, not just Norfolk Southern, but all railroads. So they had one of the lower averages amongst the class ones. To my knowledge, they've added well over 100 hot bearing detectors, and they've added, I think they went from 5 acoustics to 17 or 18 acoustics across their system now. And I think they have plans to add a few more.
Great. I know Member Brown talked a little bit about the acoustic detectors and all, but I see that Norfolk Southern has installed its first multi-scan hot bearing detector in December of 23. And how does that new technology attempt to overcome the limitations of the current hot bearing detectors?
So I believe not only Norfolk Southern, but I believe all class ones right now are running kind of a beta test on this multi-scan or multi-beam, I've heard it called, where if you remember the slide where it showed the one beam, the one scan area on the bearing on the inner portion, this multi-scan will scan up to, I think some of them do up to 8 different areas on the bearing that covers from the inner portion to the outer portion. So essentially they're trying to look at the entire bearing all the way across.
Okay, thank you. And I'd see that Norfolk Southern has reported piloting a thermal camera program in its Inman yard in Atlanta. How do thermal cameras identify overheated bearings and attempt to overcome the limitations of the current hot bearing detectors?
So they take a thermal image of the bearing when it passes by, so that the entire visible portion of the bearing, and through the thermal cameras, it's a little more accurate of the internal.
Again, we're in the questioning portion of the final NTSB hearing on what happened in East Palestine, Ohio. This portion has been questioned specifically on the bearing detectors. We learned in this one that one of the bearing detectors, the temperature variance in them wasn't exact. I'm also, again, I'm watching this live with you. But one of the cameras in Salem, Ohio showed the bearing on fire. And there's, that detector showed an elevated temperature, but There's some questioning as far as how did it not show a higher temperature considering it was on fire. So that's something. But again, I think the biggest takeaway here so far, and if you've been following this closely, this might not be new, but it's definitely the most definitive statement I've heard from the NTSB on this. They said that the Norfolk Southern's failure to communicate accurate and complete info in regards to OxyVinyl's info to the incident commander was not justified. Norfolk Southern intentionally, they had this information from the owners of the vinyl chloride that the vinyl chloride was not polymerizing and was not at risk of imminent explosion. The NTSB has the evidence by inspecting the train cars after this that in fact was true, that they were not polymerizing. Again, the NTSB kept that information from the incident commander, which was the fire chief at the time. The fire chief was not even aware that OxyVinyls was available to answer questions about this because Norfolk Southern were the only ones communicating with them. The NTSB says that they found that alternatives to the vent and burn were overlooked because of that information being withheld. Had the fire chief known that the owners of the vinyl chloride were not concerned about it exploding, he might have looked for other alternatives. Quote, the incident commander could have made a better decision regarding the vent and burn, and that is because he did not have all of the information available to him. The temperature of those cars was going down, not up, when Norfolk Southern, essentially advised the final decision to detonate these cars in East Palestine, Ohio. We'll jump back into the questions here as we may be moving on to the next topic of questions.
Palestine, the only guidance or recommendation was through the OT 55 or whatever that was referenced, that Paul referenced earlier, and it was a maximum spacing of 40 miles on key routes for key trains.
And is that changing now in the wake of?
Since then, with the safety memo that the Association of American Railroads put out on March 8th, they've committed to trying to do a 15-mile average.
And I guess sort of a broader question here. I assume these limitations, these challenges in terms of detecting bearings are not unique to the United States. Are there any trends or technologies or approaches we're seeing outside the U.S. that might be instructive in terms of importing some of those ideas here?
I think you're seeing some of the outlying technologies maybe in other countries since East Palestine, with the thermal and with the multi-beam and with some of the other technologies that have arisen. But I think the struggles are the same in other countries that the U.S. deals. It's not unique to the U.S.
Thank you. Chair, I'm going to try to save some time here. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Member Brown.
Yes, building on Tom and Member Graham's comment, the Association of American Railroads announced some new safety measures on March 8th of last year, addressing hot bearing detector spacing, which Tom just talked about, temperature threshold, close call reporting, training, and tank car improvements. Do you think these will make a significant impact on safety?
While I think they'll help, certainly decreasing the distance between the detectors will help. I think it's a step in the right direction, but as you can see in East Palestine, they already met the new threshold. So certainly that will help, but it's not the answer.
Do you have any information about talking to the other than Norfolk Southern, who are focusing on this issue? I mean, Tom mentioned, do you have any more?
No,
are they operating in silos, or are they communicating?
No, they're all communicating now, and I don't think there were necessarily silos, like, I'm not going to talk to you kind of thing. I think they just didn't communicate as well, where I know we've actually attended some of the meetings where they get together and talk about, hey, I've got this technology, it's working really well, and they discuss amongst themselves to try to build a better detection system.
Thank you. No further questions.
Member Inman.
As I hear you all talking, I'm thinking about in about 2.5 months, we'll be doing an aviation hearing. And rail is, I remember being at the Promissory Point for the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. Aviation's been around a lot less, but yet we've been able to make huge strides in not only regulation, but safety. And so I'm just kind of wondering, if rail's been around this long, everything we continue to say here is AAR, which is a trade group. Why do they get to regulate themselves versus every other mode of transportation?
Good question.
The AR exists for, one of the purpose the AR exists, they do create standards, but they also control billing standards. So most railroads don't own their own cars. They're owned by car owners and they're leased to the railroads. So they created standards, so it's fair across all, right now, 6 Class 1 railroads. There's a minimum standard that cars have to meet. For example, the 170 degrees on the bearing. If it's less than 170 degrees and the railroad decides to change the bearing out, they can't charge the owner for it. They have to pay for it themselves. So if it meets that criteria, and there's a lot of different criteria, I'm just specifically talking about the wheel. If it meets that 170 degrees or higher mark, they can bill the owner. So it's standard and fair across all 6 Class 1s.
Paul?
Yeah, just to add to that, the AAR creates standards and recommended practices, and there is an executive order that requires government agencies to incorporate by reference.
Right. What would be better is if our government officials had a little bit of backbone and would regulate them themselves instead of letting an industry trade group do it. But when half of these folks are receiving money from the railroad lobby, you end up with an industry regulating itself. That was a really good question from the member who was like, okay, airlines don't get to regulate themselves. Why do we allow railroads to do so? When clearly there is a huge risk to individual, ordinary people when the railroads do stuff like what we've seen here.
Yes, sir. And so whenever we were looking at East Palestine, they were meeting the.
That was a good point, Henry.
Intent.
I was getting ready to say you.
One every 15 miles, but it was within a 30-mile segment. So that one was 20 miles and another was 10. Did we also ask then for what your minimum and maximums were from these Class 1s when we polled them?
We didn't ask at the time. We have since asked. I have not received any of that information. My understanding was they were polling all that information through the AAR, and they were supposed to get us that data.
What did they say? Can you say that they were holding the data?
They were polling all their, I specifically reached out to all Class 1s. I did not get a response. I'll say the responses I did get were that they were, the AAR was taking the same poll and they would provide the information to me.
And so have we received that from AAR?
No, sir, I have not.
Is there any reason why they wouldn't provide the safety investigators for their motor transportation this information?
I'm not aware of any.
I think I'm done for right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Great line of questioning. I think we'll find when we get to a pipeline investigation that they also set their own standards, which is a significant concern. I'm hoping to do a little math here. And while I do it, Brett, maybe you can bring up that slide that showed the 10 miles and then the 20 miles between the detectors. The train passed a detector, then 10 miles later passed another one, then 20 miles later passed another one. Can anyone do, what's 10 plus 20? 30?
30,
Yeah, what's the average of 30?
15.
Is the AAR standard that was adopted on March 8th to have a maximum of 15 miles per hour on average for spacing detectors?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah,
15
would that
miles.
have done anything for this one to prevent it?
No, ma'am.
Not a single thing. So you're basically adopting the exact same thing, 10 miles, 20 miles, 30, 15 miles per average. They're adopting the exact same thing that occurred here.
Yes.
Is that based on science?
I'm not sure where they got their basis.
Probably not based on science. It would do absolutely nothing. Now, I will say Norfolk Southern has stated that they have a maximum, not of average, of 15 miles per hour for spacing detectors after this one. But I want someone to talk, if someone could speak to, and maybe it's you, Mr. Scott, about using averages. I have a real concern about using averages because it's not just AAR. FRA's looking at averages. Congress is talking about averages. When you talk about averages, you could have one that's 5 miles spaced and then not another one for 25 miles. You're still looking at an average of 15 miles. So can you talk about the concern with using averages versus maximums?
Yeah, so I've seen a couple studies on spacing. There has been some, I won't say private testing, but testing in Pueblo at the former technology institute there. They did some spacing data, and they essentially found that 15 miles was the ideal spacing, but not average 15 miles. They did say that they didn't see a significant difference between 7 and 15 miles, but they did see a pretty good increase between 15 miles and 20 miles. So it was like a 25% increase.
Right. And again, this to hammer the point home, this is why the railroad industry should not essentially be able to create its own rules and regulations, because they can do this. We'll do it an average of this amount of distance, when Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the NTSB committee here, is clearly pointing out why that is a major issue, because doing it at an average, if that's the new policy that they're putting forward in the AAR, the American Association of Railroaders, I could be slightly wrong on that, doesn't actually, wouldn't have prevented this situation from occurring. It needs to have a minimum number versus an average number. But again, that's what happens when you let industry regulate themselves.
We're looking at a more comprehensive approach to using many different types of technology for predicting bearing failures.
That's why we're requesting the research, because there hasn't been much research in this area to see which would be better on the restraints, the pros and cons of each, and do they need to be used in tandem, or is there a fix-all that you only have to use one? So I believe that's where we need the research in this area.
Thank you. We do have extra time, so I want to see Member Graham. Do you have anything? Member Chapman? Member Brown? Member Inman? No, okay. I had scheduled a break, but we have time, I think, to go to another round. Do you want to go right into round 2, and then we'll take a lunch break? Okay, great. We are going to move into round 2, or safety issue 2, and that is the initial emergency response. And we're going to start with questions from Member Graham, who's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. The first 911 call came in at 8:56. They dispatched the East Palestine Fire Department at 8:58. What time did the fire department arrive on scene?
A little bit after 9 p.m.
Seems like a pretty fast response for a small
quick
community.
response.
That's
Yes.
great. Shortly after arriving on scene, the East Palestine Fire Department began fighting the post-derailment fire. What fire suppression techniques were used to fight the fire, and was it effective?
Yeah, so they utilized many suppression activities, including heavy master streams from unmanned monitor nozzles, including elevated streams from ladder trucks. Amount of fire like that, there's not enough water available. So the deputy fire chief, who was the incident commander, in his interview stated that even when they were applying the fire on it, the fire just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So it was not effective.
Not effective. Thank you. I see 48 agencies were reportedly involved in the emergency response, including fire departments from East Liverpool in Beaver County. What was the degree of hazardous materials experience or training from the responding agencies?
Yeah, so those experience varied. The responding hazardous materials team from East Liverpool and Beaver County, they were the responding hazardous materials teams. So they had technicians trained to the technician level, including the cache of equipment that they would need for detections, sampling, all that stuff. So they brought people trained to do technician level work. They never got into that phase. Other responding agencies, those training levels varied from responders not having any hazardous materials training to responders that were trained to the awareness, operations, and technician level.
Great. During that response, were any of the the firefighting roles tailored to each firefighter's training or experience within the response?
Yeah, that's hard to do when you allow various levels of training, allowing responders to have no training at all to having firefighters train to the highest training, which is firefighter 2. An incident commander bases his emergency response actions on training expertise. So if I don't know the minimum training levels of at least an emergency responder that's coming as a firefighter 1, that's prohibited from performing actions in an IDLH atmosphere or doing any type of advanced fire attack stuff, it's hard to set those emergency action plans. So that's why it's important to have at least that firefighter 1 minimum across the board. I know what I'm getting. I know what I'm getting. I know I can put these people to work in certain situations.
Great, thank you for that. The command post was first established 400 feet from the fire. What increased risks to the firefighters were associated with the establishment of that command post 400 feet away from the fire?
Yeah, NFPA and both the National Incident Management System states that a command post should be established in a cold zone. You want your staff away from the hazards, from smoke accumulation, from fires and all that stuff. So you want your decision makers, and then including your firefighters too, out of the danger zone until those proper actions could be put in place. The initial command post was at the Lake Oil property, which was roughly 400 or 500 feet from the burning rail cars, definitely inside the hot zone, which NFPA states that the command post should not be in a hot zone.
So I know they didn't get the consist for what, about an hour, I think it was at least. But seeing the tank cars when they arrived and trying to put out the fire, what was the ERG guidance for tank car fires?
That would be for Guide 111, as I showed on my presentation earlier. The emergency response guide provides a decision tree matrix, a yes and no decision tree, depending on what you can see. That's depending on placards. If I can see the placards, if I can see identification markings on rail cars or anything like that. If I can't, and that night there was low visibility, a lot of smoke, so it would be almost impossible to see those indicators to let you know what you're dealing with. The emergency response guide takes the safest course of action and leads you to Guide 111, which is that 1/2 mile evacuation zone. Keep your people away from the area.
Great, thank you. I see my time's up.
Thank you. Member Chapman.
Just following up on that quickly, so the Guide 111 is essentially a default. If you don't have sufficient information, that's where you go.
Absolutely.
Question about the train consist. I believe the first request for that information was made at 9:04 p.m. And that request was made by calling the Norfolk Southern Dispatch Center. The information wasn't provided at that time. Do we know why?
No, we could not determine. The East Palestine Fire Dispatch Center called the NS Atlanta Dispatch Center around 9:04. The person that answered the call at the NS Dispatch Center told the dispatch center in East Palestine that they would call them back. We could not determine if that phone call was ever returned.
And what has Norfolk Southern done since the accident to try to ensure that there's better response in a circumstance like that?
Yeah. So right now, NS has partnered with a solution called Rapid SOS. It's a robust technology that would provide real-time train contests to emergency responders. It actually goes to the dispatch centers, and the dispatch centers can forward this out to emergency responders' phones. Almost like an Ask Rail on steroids, but I don't have to input any data. So NS is also partnered up with the Columbia County Emergency Management Agency and trained a lot of the emergency responders on the Ask Rail application. and have also completed training in 5 of their 911 dispatch centers. So it's been a proactive action so far.
And in your view, are those pretty substantial improvements in
I
terms
do,
of?
yes, I do, absolutely.
And I do want to talk about the Ask Rail application. Based on interviews,
Again, I want to make clear here, these are like things that the railroad industry is doing to regulate themselves and to offer things after these disasters have happened. The federal government so far is requiring none of this, which is, again, that it's I'm beating a dead horse with this point, but I just want to be clear that these things that are happening are just, Norfolk Southern trying to clean up their mess after it happened and not being regulated by the U.S. government. So.
Emergency Services and the Chief of Hazard Materials reported that he was unable to get the same Ask Rail application to work until about 2:00 a.m., several hours later.
Yes.
Can you comment on the discrepancy of those two experiences? Do we know why that occurred?
Yeah, so we know that interviewing the East Liverpool Fire Chief, he had his technician that was riding with him in his emergency response vehicle. They found one of the rail cars in a safe location out of the hot zone area, and you can easily input a rail car number in the Ask Rail. And it provided him everything that he needed, the train concepts, all that. He was able to get to it. When talking to the director of Beaver County, for some reason, when he tried to use the Ask Rail application, it would not load for him. It would not load for him. That's going to be, that's any problem with an Ask Rail mobile application. You always have to have some type of cell phone activity, cell phone coverage connected to a Wi-Fi, things of that nature. That's why a lot of your fire apparatus now are equipping your units with Wi-Fi capabilities, that they would always have that boost in cell phone service so they can get to applications like Ask Rail and things of that nature.
Do we think this might have been a connectivity issue?
Yeah, he could not. We asked him, did he know what the problem was? He didn't know if could have been a problem with the app. It could have been a cell phone service. I really don't know if it's so many users will get on it that it runs out of bandwidth.
Yeah.
I don't know that, but we just know that the East Palestine Fire Chief brought it up easily. The Beaver County director did have problems getting to Ask Rail.
And Ask Rail is an AAR app, is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
And has there been any post-accident effort by AAR to boost the performance of Ask Rail or address any of the issues that we saw here?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Member Brown.
Yeah, I just want to build on the Ask Rail. My question, because Member Chapman got just about all of it, but do you think it's going to be very consistent in rural areas, given like my home state of Florida, they have a lot of hurricanes and storms? Will they still work if the app will still work if there are no cell towers?
It's just like any type of application that you have to deal with cell phone activity. The nation's cell service, it depends on if it's weather, if it's anything, rural areas. But the thing about Ask Rail, it's still a good application. It's an application that can be used from a safe distance. It allows that emergency responder to keep themselves out of harm's way while getting that app, or maybe waiting for that train consist from a train crew. But there's going to be situations where the app may not work, and it was proven at East Palestine.
Thank you.
Member Inman.
Thank you. And Paul, I'd like to take you back a little bit. In our research, we found where the NTSB had investigated 3 derailments involving vinyl chloride. The first one in Livingston, Louisiana, September 28, 1982, 42 years ago. I'm pretty sure you didn't work that one.
I was around, but not there.
Paulsboro, New Jersey, November 30th, 2012. And then, of course, East Palestine. I think it's worthy to call out the incident commander, the chief and the deputy chief. Can you mention the differences in what we investigated in the Paulsboro versus this? Because I think you led that as an IIC, correct?
I did. At the Paulsboro derailment, there was a circumstance there where the train derailed on a movable bridge, and one of the vinyl chloride tank cars, which incidentally was a sister tank car to the one involved here in East Palestine, was punctured. It was constrained in the bridge structure, and a trailing car coupler punctured the tank wall and released a vapor cloud that lingered over the creek. The name of the creek was Montauk Creek. And the vapor cloud hung in that area for quite a while and then drifted into the town of Paulsboro. Well, the deputy fire chief lived next to the bridge, and he established his command post about 50 yards from the breached tank car, exposing his crew and all of the responders to the vapor.
Much different situation that we're seeing now.
Yes, sir.
In 42 years ago, in rereading that Louisiana report, they had trouble getting the consist information and identifying what was involved. Did they have the same thing in Paulsboro, New Jersey?
I do recall there was difficulty. It seems like it happens on every derailment that we have this issue come up.
It seems like it
I
happens
remember
on
that there
every
was-
derailment that they have a hard time finding the consist. If that's not a blaring red alarm, I don't know what is.
First responders, yes.
Perennial problems.
It's
But every time that we
single-
investigate, we are told that they're going to make changes and things are going to get better.
Very unusual
don't.
that doesn't come up.
Thank you. Troy, I know we kind of talked, I mean, being a former instructor for the National Fire Academy, I used to teach these volunteer fire departments, and it was identified, very early on about the amount of training. And you talked about the 36-hour rule and how it didn't include hazmat training. I would suspect that was well-intentioned whenever it was originally written.
Paulsboro was also
Maybe
dealing
now
with
we
vinyl chloride.
reevaluate.
That's how it was related.
What's probably the biggest barrier for volunteer fire departments to actually get the additional training that they need?
And it's just not only in East Palestine, it's every volunteer fire department that's in the nation. It's the 40-hour work week. I'm a volunteer, plus I have a job. So, but plus I want to support my community to help them out in any way. It's finding funding for training. Some of these classes are $1,500 or $2,000. To outfit a firefighter alone with structural firefighting gear and SCBA, you're talking $20,000, $25,000 with equipment. So it's a funding issue. It's a time issue to get the volunteers into training. It's travel times. Some states have supported good support with volunteers where they do incentive programs. For one, the state of Maryland actually gives volunteer firefighters tax breaks, which it lures people to come to the fire department and go, hey, what can I do?
Thank you,
to
Tony D.
help to get that tax break? So there's things to do, and they're researchable, but it will always be a problem with the volunteer.
And I guess I want to point out, I think we're going to have a recommendation to the state of Ohio, but I know that Governor DeWine put together this task force, and while it's not fully incorporated, it is discussing those barriers and has some really great recommendations.
Yes.
And I hope that the state will take that up, along with a lot of other states in the National Volunteer Fire Council.
And that's a very good report.
And I'd be hesitant not to put up, I've got my binders.
Yeah.
This week is National Fire Data Week, and the U.S. Fire Academy has actually put out a report in October of last year regarding funding barriers and how rural departments can find those. So I hope we can help make those resources available as well, just as an educational tool.
Yep.
Thank you. I want to back up a little bit because we have a lot of members of the community here and just talk about what we sort of take for granted when we're talking about these issues. We have the opportunity to what does a train consist convey? And what important safety decisions are made by emergency responders based on timely receipt of that consist information?
Good, Paul.
So a train consist is a list of all of the rail cars on a train And on that list are highlighted the hazardous materials that are on the train in order of the consist or in order of the composition of the train from front to back. The hazardous materials are identified by the DOT proper shipping name, the hazard class, the UNID number, which is used to look up information about the hazards of the chemical, and the packing group is appropriate. It also, if you know where the derailment begins and where a derailment ends, then you can take that section of the consist and figure out what potential hazardous materials are involved in the incident. And that's important to know so that you can then determine the appropriate evacuation distance, the appropriate personal protective equipment that's required, and the community evacuations that are necessary.
And we have repeatedly investigated accidents, derailments where train consist information was not provided in a timely manner, including accurate train consist information in Anding, Mississippi. But you know, for this one, we had responders, everybody, and I'll just focus on the incident commanders. The deputy chief was asking for what was on that train for quite some time. I think it's really fortunate that one of the volunteer firefighters from that department was also a chemistry teacher and was utilized on scene to evaluate some of the dangers. I thought that was really resourceful and incredible, but not ideal. When you have a derailment that occurs at 8:56, you have an ATC desk back in Atlanta that can hit a button. It's not walking around with papers anymore as it was decades ago. You have a button that you can hit send and get that information immediately to those who need it. Norfolk Southern in this case showed up on scene without that information. In fact, they were asked for that information repeatedly after they showed up. Now, I do understand the county had it. I have questions on sharing of that information an hour later, but it was still an hour later.
Right. There's basically
So
2
that,
hours where
and,
there was
you know,
like
I will
most people
show,
didn't know,
if we
more
can pull
hours
up
for
that
a lot
video
of others.
of, this was shared with me by Chief Comstock. Thank you, Chief, who heads the Western Joint Fire District. I think that's good. At the time, the chief was out of town. He got this video from his responders. He pulled them back, told them to get back. But this is why. This is why, you know, I'm a mom. We have, you know, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds that are volunteer firefighters. They need to be protected, which is why we're talking about training opportunities and the need for train consist information. I'll get to training in the second round. But a question I have regarding train consist information, then you have placards that burn. Certainly there is stenciling and other sort of technology that the railroads could voluntarily move to ensure placards aren't getting burned, to ensure paint isn't burning off. And then there's the Ask Rail app where people cannot log on. I think there are some limitations because when you have a train derailment, car line 23 can now be somewhere else. So there are some limitations, not just cell service, but also the location of those cars. With that, I am going to ask Member Graham to go ahead for another 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to go back to the emergency response guide. And what does that state about the appropriate evacuation zone for derailed tank cars with unknown contents?
1/2 mile radius evacuation.
Okay, that's for the public. Is that for the firefighters?
That's for the emergency responders as well. It's always life safety first for everyone.
Okay, so initially, at minimum, should have been a 1/2 mile
Absolutely.
when they showed up.
Yes.
Even the firefighters.
Yes.
Can you discuss the risk of the water from the firefighting activities entering containers with unknown contents?
Yeah, it's a major concern because actually in Guide 111, it states that some of the products may be water reactive. So I might be spraying water on a hazardous chemical that could actually make a situation worse, either some type of explosive or chemical reaction, spreading a fire. So sometimes putting water on fires that you really don't know what you're putting it on could make matters worse, but you just don't know what the chemicals are.
So very important to
Yes.
know the consist and what you're up against. And not knowing the contents of the tank cars initially when they showed up, how do incident commanders determine the appropriate PPE for the responding firefighters?
Yeah, because that's also stated in Guide 111 as well. And again, unknown chemicals.
Thank you, Nikki, for the super chat.
Regular
We
structural
very much appreciate
firefighting
it.
gear is not suitable for all occasions. So some chemicals could actually break down a firefighter's protective equipment. It could break down your SCBA, your SCBA that you're wearing. It could affect the rubber seal around your face. So it's sometimes the guide states, don't rush in, take your time, research what you have, use the Guide 111, keep your people safe, and wait for the experts to come in that know more about the trains, know more about the burning chemicals, and then set that safest course of action once everything's been researched.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to jump over to the consist for just a second. Does Norfolk Southern have a procedure or policy for distribution of that to first responders?
Yeah, they do. It's under HM1.
HM1?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to switch to the placarding right now. We know it's important to have legible placards and everything, and we knew the environment that they were up against, the dark and things burning. It was very difficult to see the placards and everything. Can you discuss the East Palestine Deputy Fire Chief's observations of the tank car placards while on scene in the aftermath of the derailment?
Yeah, he described the placards not being able to be identified, either being burned off. This happened at night, so you got low light visibility and you got a lot of smoke accumulation. So that's going to affect all types of visibility on trying to read the placards. And then high heat flame impingement actually destroyed the placards where they couldn't properly be identified.
How can placards be designed to improve the survivability when exposed to a fire like at the derailment?
It's a good question, Member Graham. We've been shown some examples of solutions to that with the use of intumescent paint. There's another solution where in the placard holder, you have the tag board placard placed in front of a stenciled cutout on steel, so that if the placard were to burn away, you would at least have a UNID number and a hazard symbol that even though it might not be the correct color, you would still be able to identify the material. So there are a number of solutions to that. The biggest problem here, as Chair Hamady pointed out, when you have a chaotic derailment and the tank cars get moved around, even if you have the consist, it's very hard to determine which cars are where, what's involved and what's not involved. The tank car reporting marks, the tank car number is indexed to the train consist. So you need to be able to find that or the placard. Without either one, you're totally lost, and that's what happened here.
Yeah, I remember even, I think it was Sunday morning, we were at the Incident Command Center looking at our drone footage, trying to figure out, everybody was there trying to figure out which car was which, still, almost 2 days into it.
Yeah,
Thank you, Chair.
and again, that's what's important. Like Chair Hamady said, car 32 becomes car 16 or whatever. That's why it's important to don't rush in, trust your emergency response guidance,
Yeah, I can attest. So in the early days of this, we were inspecting drone footage, some of which was exclusive to us, some of which was NTSB drone footage, and you really couldn't tell the differences in cars. We were even going through with folks, again, who worked in the industry, trying to identify what was going on when we were following other leads early on in this investigation.
This area, and it has to do with improving training. I really just want to ask this question to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about why we're recommending what we're recommending. There is a draft recommendation we'll consider later on today to 3 organizations: the National Volunteer Fire Council, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and the International Association of Firefighters. Would you just talk about how the individual roles and then their role in combination with each other can help us improve training so we can help prevent future exposure of firefighters to unnecessary risk?
Yeah, so the National Volunteer Fire Council is the representative agency or association that represents the volunteer fire departments throughout the nation. They have a lot of symposiums, a lot of training opportunities, very robust outreach to volunteer fire departments, live training, web training. They're constantly in contact with the volunteer fire departments, trying to make them better, trying to provide them funding opportunities who you can talk to get new equipment, training opportunities, things of that nature. The International Association of Fire Chiefs, much larger, but it's dealing with more of your current or past fire chiefs. The one that could be providing that training. The fire chiefs are at that level. They got that expertise, so they can provide that training, all that stuff. So how we're proposing a recommendation is we're hitting all 3 associations that's representing every single firefighter in the United States. And actually, the International Association of Firefighters crosses the border into Canada as well. So it's the right way to go.
So pooling capabilities, pooling different focuses,
Yes.
trying to get to essentially a
Yeah.
sort of a magnified
Yeah.
impact in terms of improving training.
And they're all connected. They talk amongst each other all the time about training opportunities and symposiums, things of that nature.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair. That's my last question in this area.
Thank you very much, Member Brown.
Yeah, I just want to comment to build on that, as someone who understands very well as a former mayor and how important it is for training for first responders, particularly in small towns like East Palestine, where they don't have the resources, the access. We rely on them when there's a crisis, and
Rodney, so that has been brought up a little bit earlier on. It will be brought up again in a later round of questioning. This just to recap a little bit of where we're on. So initially in this is the final NTSB hearing on what happened in East Palestine, Ohio, that we're currently watching on the screen at the moment. In the beginning of the day here, we kind of had a run through of their investigation so far. Frankly, not a ton of like brand new information. But some of the highlights that we've hit so far, and I'm going to start off with the biggest one. This was kind of the strongest statement from the NTSB, although very much less than what it should be at this point, where they directly came out and said, and I want to be clear here, I have some notes that I put in front of me. They came out and said that, quote, the incident commander could have made a better decision regarding the vent and burn. The incident commander in this case was the fire chief. And the reason that he could have made a better decision was because the NTSB said that Norfolk Southern's failure to communicate accurate and complete information in regards to Oxyvinyl's information, Oxyvinyls being the company that owned the vinyl chloride in the first case, which was saying that there was no risk of imminent explosion of these cars, that the tanker cars were actually going down in temperature. They were advising not to detonate them and to wait. The NTSB said, though, that Norfolk Southern's failure to communicate that information from Oxyvinyl to the incident commander was not justified. Again, Norfolk Southern intentionally withheld information from the fire chief, who was the incident commander at this time, about that info regarding the vinyl chloride not at risk of imminent explosion. And the fire chief didn't even know that asking for Oxyvinyl's opinion on this was even a possibility. That was also withheld from the incident commander in the situation, which is absolutely wild. The NTSB is also saying here that they found plenty of alternatives to the vent and burn that were overlooked as a result of this information not being shared. I do want to listen in here just in case we're moving into the next round of questioning.
County Hazardous Materials Response Team supported the efforts, and they actually were providing, I think, air monitoring with photoionization detectors that could detect vinyl chloride. Did we find any evidence that they did or did not detect vinyl chloride?
Yeah, they interviewed, stated that you've got some robust meters right now, 5 and 6 gas meters that you can put, special electrochemical meters in them to detect just certain chemicals, hydrogen cyanide, vinyl chloride.
Could have made a better decision.
Materials team
That's
come
what I was saying.
equipped with this strategic equipment. So in his interview, they did state that they detected traces of vinyl chloride, which was most likely through probably the venting process. So it's going to be an air monitoring.
While the PRDs were venting, is that what
Yeah.
you're saying?
Yeah.
Not the vent and burn process.
No, this is no
Paul, you
Beaver.
look like you want to say something.
Yeah, no Beaver County, all the fire department response agencies doing the testing they've already left the scene when the vent and burn took place. So Beaver County was already back at their station when the vent and burn took place.
So just a point of clarification, a photoionization detector isn't a material-specific detector. It'll detect any volatile organic compound within a very specific range. If you know the specific material that's released, then there's a correction factor, and then you can measure the actual concentration that way. But
You're actually repeating some of your work from the Paulsboro report where, and I just wanted to point out, in that one, oxyvinyl was on scene within, I believe, 2 hours of the derailment with 2 separate detectors, provided one to the incident command and kept one as well, and provided a lot of the information regarding the amount that was being dispersed in the community at that time.
yes.
That's just shaking your head.
Yes,
correct?
that's correct. Yes.
Okay,
I
sorry.
mean, they measured over 500
Yeah.
parts per million in my recollection.
I'm sorry for going back to Paulsboro, but it's got to be frustrating in some respect, because at that point, we were recommending May 15th, 2012, and FRA had said that they had met with the AAR and that they were looking to find a system to get consist information available immediately. And yet yesterday, they decided to put out a rule to say that they're finally going to do it. 12 years later, in multiple different crises. What would be the one thing, if we were to tell someone today what they have to do to make train and rail safety better, if they could just snap their fingers?
Actually regulate it.
If you're talking about conveying hazard information to the emergency responders, do that the very first thing you do. Don't, if you have a fire in your house, you call the fire department first, right? If you have a derailment, you should call the emergency responders first before you notify your internal communication tree. Get that information in their hands right away.
Troy?
I think in general, if you want to make rail much safer, keep them from derailing.
Say it again?
Keep a train from derailing. So if a train accident doesn't happen.
KISS method, right?
I don't have to be there. Train's going to get to its destination. People may not be put in harm's way. So to me, the safest action is keep them on the rails. They're designed to stay on the rails.
I don't know that we'll put a recommendation in the actual docket for that, but it's good advice. I'll just, and one last reflection, if you will. I go back to a former chairman who wrote a concurring opinion in that report that said that there were some real concerns. 2 issues became very apparent. What's the best way for emergency response community to prepare for potentially catastrophic events that are infrequent nationwide and that at any given location may not occur more than once, if that often, in the entire career of the emergency responders? Separately, given the large percentage of volunteer firefighters in our nation's forces, how can they attain the training they need to do their job adequately without being required to have so much training that people who have full-time jobs will choose not to be a volunteer firefighter? I mean, I don't know that we actually learn our lessons after each one of these derailments, but I can promise you we're going to try this time.
And this accident would have been overwhelming for any response agency.
Absolutely.
Huge, huge, huge response. And it would have been overwhelming for any response agency.
Totally agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to go back. Member Graham had asked about Norfolk Southern's protocol for relaying consist information to emergency responders, and the HM1 hazardous materials instructions for rail was mentioned as their protocol. And I'm just going to read the protocol, which says, when receiving a request for shipping documents, provided to the emergency response information to emergency responders. You shouldn't have to wait to receive a request. The derailment occurred at 8:54, 8:56. The ATC desk, Atlanta knew, the crew called it in, hit the button. You don't have to wait for a request from a community to provide consist information. After
This is a
Paulsboro,
good point as well.
they came up with Ask Rail. It's not as effective.
You shouldn't need to ask
INT
for it. They should be
PHMSA
distributing that
finally
information as quickly as
issued a
possible.
rule yesterday requiring immediate notification. Could you provide a little bit of information on that regulation that they issued yesterday, just for a second?
Yeah, so you want to talk about that?
Kara?
Yes, so the requirement, the rule applies to all railroads, not just class ones. So it applies to 2s and 3s as well. It requires immediate notification to the public safety answering point, which is essentially the 911 call center in the locality.
Immediate notification. A deputy chief should not be left without information for hours. A chief who is the incident commander should not have to wait to see it until 2 o'clock in the morning while it's laying on a table. Did we look at differences on volunteer firefighter standards between Ohio and Pennsylvania?
No, we did not. But I do know that the state of Pennsylvania has a lot more of the pro board certification trainings. Ohio has the firefighter 1 and the firefighter 2 levels that you can pro board. Pennsylvania has numerous, including instructor level, fire level 1, fire level 2, that they can pro board, which takes numerous classes to get that certification. So Pennsylvania is one of the top states that has a robust training program.
Yeah, and provides the funding as well. For volunteer firefighters, it is NFPA 1001, which is going to be incorporated in 1010, basic first aid and CPR, and hazmat operations level training, which I'm certified at. That's beyond awareness training, and then some engine certifications with the Bureau of Fire Training Standards. So they do have more robust training. I will add to what Member Inman said. I do think the Ohio Task Force on Volunteer Fire Service did issue a good task force report, and we spoke 3 times with the Ohio State Fire Marshal about my office about this report. It was issued, unfortunately, 2 weeks before the derailment, and sort of was everybody forgot about it. It includes a lot of great information, including a statement that says volunteer firefighters are limited to 36 hours, while a paid career firefighter must complete 244 hours. The current 36-hour restriction on volunteer firefighting certification training is an outdated 40-year-old state law that has not kept pace with the constantly changing demands on the fire service. As a direct consequence of the outdated 36-hour requirement, the current volunteer firefighter curriculum delivery model is extremely fast-paced, instructor-led, classroom lecture, followed by an expedited demonstration of the hands-on skills. They go through several recommendations. It's a great report. Unfortunately, it hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. Hopefully, and I intend when I speak with the governor to talk about reconvening the task force. I know they'd like to do additional work to make sure that this gets the appropriate attention it deserves to ensure firefighter safety. Thank you. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair. I just have one question about post-derailment actions. Can you discuss the actions Norfolk Southern has taken to improve training for first responders in East Palestine and the surrounding communities?
Yeah, they, as stated earlier, they partnered up with the CCEMA. They did some robust training on AskRail. They've been in this area for a while now, doing some extra.
Again, it's great that Norfolk Southern is doing these things, but there is basically zero new regulation coming from the federal government or state government. So it really needs to come from the federal government here, because the federal government has authority over the railroads, given that they're crossing all of these state lines. I mean, this section is a little bit of a lot of it's been a waste of time, frankly, because these are recommendations for this board or that board. And like, you know, I do think that, like, obviously we want to get our first responders as prepared as possible. Yes. However, nothing is going to change if no one is going to hold these railroads accountable. Again, they hold themselves accountable, meaning no one holds them accountable. It's absolutely ridiculous. I'm seeing Mayor Pete helps us. He has not done anything, frankly, on this, which is disappointing at best. You know, again, as all this was happening, and I do want to kind of keep chiming in and to make sure, because I know they're getting ready to go on a break
to give them
here.
Expert advice. Many of them at that point mentioned that they were worried about their liability of providing that advice. And we had a recommendation regarding Good Samaritan laws. You'd think that you wouldn't have to make that type of recommendation whenever a town is burning down. And we're seeing a progression, maybe that shippers, as I understand, don't often show up as much in additional incidents. And I know we said that there were 2 at the Paulsboro, and while OxyVinyl's experts were in the ground, they were never in the room. What's the barrier that's stopping from using that expert information and that guidance so that they're in the room and can actually raise their hand when it's necessary?
Well, by regulation, they're required to have a point of contact telephonically.
And they did.
Oftentimes, it's very rare that I've seen a shipper on the ground. It happens from time to time. But they're required to have a person available who has technical knowledge for mitigating an incident and knowledge of the hazardous material. It happens often that they're consulted, often from a distance, like this initially started out that way. But as I said, it's rare that they actually come to a scene. But I don't see any barrier to them to be a part of an incident command system. That system is designed to be flexible. NIMS is flexible. They could have been part of an incident command. There's just no requirement currently to require them to deploy to a scene, though.
No requirement currently, and
but there is
Norfolk Southern withheld
for the
information
railroad
from the
operator.
incident commander on this.
Well, the railroad operator definitely, because they're legally responsible for the incident. They're the responsible party.
So they're responsible for chemicals that someone else has made and has expertise on?
As the carrier, they're responsible for derailment.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I could add, Brett, can you bring up slide 102, please? So this is a slide of unified command. Unified command is for complex incidents. It's built as if your incident gets bigger, this incident command expands. It grows. What's unique about incident unified command is it's just not one sole incident commander. It's a number of incident commanders that sit at the table that make the informed decisions as a consensus. And they agree to those. They agree to those decisions to make it flow.
And Norfolk Southern
having one
withheld information from
is
this.
not unified command. So, for instance, it's if you own a piece of the pie, you're going to have a seat at that table. The railroad, the shipper, it could be the car manufacturer, but then each one is broke out. And it's in its own design. So the fire department may have life safety along with law enforcement doing evacuations. You may have your railroad doing air monitoring and things of that nature. You may have your shipper doing research and stuff. But your key incident commanders are sitting at one table. And when everybody hears a decision, everybody agrees to that decision. That's what's unique about unified command.
And let me go back to one thing you just said, though. It's the hauler, the railroad, is the one that's ultimately responsible. It's not whoever's putting those contents, because we saw here that we have, and I think we'll get into a little further, we had shippers that were putting chemicals in a tank car with non-compatible material, and they've obviously utilizing some of the regulations on tank car design of not even putting steel on top, aluminums, because it's lighter, but yet they say that they're conforming to the actual rules. Is that an area we need to address further?
In different circumstances where you might have a non-accident release, the shippers are more held responsible for that than the carrier would be. The carrier will oftentimes mitigate it for the shipper, but in terms of enforcement, I think FRA would be looking at the shipper in a circumstance like that.
It all goes back to who gets billed, right?
I guess, I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask about communications? There were some communications challenges, some discussion about multi-agency communication systems or response communication systems or marks. This is not something new. The NTSB has issued several recommendations regarding interoperability of radio communications on scenes so that responding agencies can talk to each other and communicate. Here we had 48 entities responding. They do need to talk to each other. It's a very chaotic scene. Mr. Hiller was the lead on DuPont, Washington, where there were significant communications challenges. So Mr. Lloyd, can you talk about some of that?
Yeah, so radio interoperability has been a problem in the fire service for decades. It was actually really discussed during the 9/11 Commission reports. You had multiple agencies responding to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and they all just couldn't talk. Communications is safety vital. You have to be able to talk to one another. That's how emergency response, emergency action plans are put in place. It stops freelancing. You need that positive communication. And it's a problem, but as Member Brown spoke on earlier, that could be the importance of MOUs, reaching out to that fire department going, hey, what are your radio capabilities? This is what we have. This is what we use. What can we do combined our communication so we can talk to one another? But you're talking, it's a major funding issue for radio interoperability, millions and millions and millions of dollars. Right now, there's radio manufacturers for one portable radio to outfit a firefighter's $9,000 to $12,000. And that's depending on what bells and whistles you want with that portable radio. Whether you want multiple channels, you want radio interoperable channels, you want life-saving alerts, depends on what you want. But it's a funding issue.
Who could address funding issues?
For the fire department, a good one would be what Member Enman spoke on, would be the United States Fire Administration. Reach out to them. FEMA would be another good one. They provide millions of dollars through Safe Rack grants where fire departments that I know of have received grant money to upgrade the radios. There's funding opportunities out there. You got to know how to research them and get those grants.
Has the county changed anything with respect to communications issues since this one?
They have not.
They have not. And in this case, they also have an emergency operations plan. They have a hazard mitigations plan. They have a hazardous materials response plan. I saw a little bit in there, but there wasn't much on train derailment. Is that right?
That's correct.
Have they changed that?
No.
Even to address communication? No. There are several opportunities. Certainly, the state is watching and could provide funding. The federal government certainly could provide funding. Congress could provide funding. We don't recommend issue recommendations on funding. We've never done that. But it's certainly an opportunity and something to highlight as a resource. With that, I think we're going to go ahead and break for lunch for half an hour. We're going to go to 1:15. We'll be back here and start promptly at 1:15.
So again, this is the final hearing on the NTSB's report from East Palestine, Ohio. Let me get that off the screen there for a second. Again, Status Coup has been covering this story on the ground, starting just in the week or two directly after the derailment. We've been back on 7 or 8 reporting trips at this point. I've personally been back 5 times myself, speaking to residents, digging into all of the things that are now finally kind of getting a little bit of light. Although, there could be a lot more definitive statements being made here. Again, last year, about this time, it was in June of last year, there was a similar NTSB hearing with like the preliminary findings. In that preliminary finding, kind of the biggest bombshell we got out of it was somebody, representative from Vinyls, the company that owns the vinyl chloride. We just heard some discussion about Vinyls in that portion of the questioning phase in the hearing. That individual testified that they had been in communication with Norfolk Southern and advised them that the vinyl chloride cars did not need to be detonated. Because the temperatures were trending downwards and polymerization was not occurring. So we had that information last year. Now we have the NTSB, who's now done their full investigation. They're further confirming this is lame that this is the kind of the takeaway, but like they are more definitively now than ever saying that this was the case. I want to pull up a couple of my notes here just to make sure I'm getting all of these points through again. So the NTSB has said that they withheld information from the incident commander, who was the fire chief of East Palestine at the point. The East Palestine fire chief did not know that Norfolk Southern was even communicating with Vinyls. He did not know that they were available to provide information on the vinyl chloride. Again, Vinyls is the expert on vinyl chloride for this. They owned the chemical itself there, right? So Norfolk Southern did not tell the fire chief that their recommendation was to wait and not detonate these, again, considering the temperatures were going down. And to their knowledge, they did not believe polymerization was occurring. In further investigation of the evidence, the NTSB has confirmed that polymerization was not occurring in these cars, meaning that those cars did not need to be detonated. The detonation of those 5 cars of vinyl chloride is the main source of the vast majority of the problems that have gone on for the last year and a half in East Palestine, Ohio. Again, these folks have dealt with all sorts of health issues that we have covered extensively here on Status Coup. I've spoken to people directly who have, in the early days, and even throughout, we're dealing with everything from sore throats and rashes to hair falling out to bad headaches. I've all sorts of things. I've experienced a lot of these things myself. The downstream effects of not only the vinyl chloride, which is a known carcinogen, but the chemicals that are created when you set vinyl chloride on fire are even worse in a lot of cases. You end up with chemicals like hydrogen chloride. You end up with formaldehyde. You end up with phosgene, which is literally like a weapon of war in World War I. These are things that were created, and not only did Norfolk Southern fail us, obviously, in withholding that information from the fire chief, but then our federal government agencies came in behind them in a lot of cases and told everybody that everything was fine and dandy. Not exaggerating. I mean, 3 days after the massive chemical plume, which you have seen before at this stage in the day, 3 days later, the Environmental Protection Agency told families in East Palestine that it was fine to return home. Totally fine. So what did parents do? They went back with their kids into East Palestine, and their kids got extremely sick. I remember on the first reporting trip meeting Candace for the first time, who's a resident in East Palestine, who, in the days after the derailment had to rush her young, I believe he was 2 or 3 at the time, year old son to the hospital. And when she got to the hospital, they wouldn't see him until he had a decontamination shower. But the EPA said that it was safe. Why would this poor woman need to have a decontamination shower for her child if the area was safe deemed by the EPA? It doesn't make sense. That's just one anecdote of dozens and dozens and dozens of them. It's not hard to find if you spend any time in East Palestine. It's not hard to find these things happening. So this afternoon, the NTSB is going to continue this hearing. There's going to be questioning on the vent and burn portion of this, which will definitely be interesting. Among other things, we are going to summarize the second half of this in a video. So for the 600 plus of you watching right now, if you're not subscribed already, please consider subscribing here on YouTube. Also, we're not able to continue to do this reporting. There's without the support of folks like you who are watching. Our members make all of this possible. You can become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. You can do so by joining us at statuscoup.com/join. The link is right down here below, statuscoup.com/join, to be able to support the kind of reporting that we've been doing over the past several years, or a year and a half, on this story. But beyond East Palestine, it's also places like Flint, Michigan, Kalamazoo. The list goes on. Again, they're breaking for lunch right now. This is going to continue, but we are going to summarize the remainder of this in a video. If you're not subscribed on the YouTube channel, consider hitting the subscribe button down below just to make sure you get that video with the update on what is going on, because frankly, I doubt that we're going to see any of this on CNN or Fox or MSNBC. The focus is elsewhere on political horse race of who's going to win the debate between Biden and Trump. I tell you, who will lose the debate is all of us, because of the brain cells that we're going to lose in the process of watching that. Anyway, I am going to wrap this up. We've been on here for 3.5 hours this morning so far. I want to thank everybody who joined us throughout the day today. We had a couple super chats that I want to just give them another shout out here. So Nikki O'Brien, thank you, Status Coup. Love y'all. No one has covered this crime against humanity like you have. $9.99. Thank you very much, Nikki. Tony D gave a Status Coup news membership. Appreciate that. Das Bosch Fleisch, good to see you as well. I know I've been fairly busy with a lot of other work, but the Status Coup team has obviously done a fantastic job as usual, continuing to cover this. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be around a ton, but I will still pop in and out occasionally when Jordan needs the extra set of hands. Also, Morel Compass, $2. Thank you for still covering this. Very much appreciate it. Thank you all again so much for watching. We really appreciate it. Again, hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already, just so that you can make sure you do see the video that will come out following this in the next day or so, covering the remainder of this hearing. Thank you all very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.